Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We still have a number of people getting signed in, so we will be starting up in just a moment. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are going to get started. Welcome to our Gardening for Birds, Butterflies, Pollinators, and More workshop. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center, and I will be your host today. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself after we get going a little bit. A quick note for some housekeeping before we get started. You can download all of the slides in this presentation from our website. If you want to refer back to anything, especially later on in the presentation, I'll bring you through a guide for Southern California, where we are, of the most common like backyard birds and butterflies and things like that you'll see. So if you want to download those slides, you can do that as a single PDF file at the link on the screen here. If you go to cbwcd.org/presentations, so I'm going to type that into the chat right now in case you need to, or you want to look back at that or write it down in the future. But if you go to cbwcd.org/presentations, that will take you directly to just a list of all of the slideshow downloads of all the presentations that we do. So look for Gardening for Birds, Butterflies, Pollinators, and More. It's a pretty large file. The easiest thing to do is right click and then select, depending on your browser, it's usually something like Save Linked File As, and then download it. This is also being recorded, and you will be able to rewatch after. I'm actually going to be out on vacation next week. So after probably about a week and a half and some editing, you'll be able to rewatch this workshop if you want to refer to anything. However, there's a very similar past version of this workshop already on the YouTube channel. So if you want to refer back to anything or share the content with friends or family, you can do that at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And if you go to that link, that will take you directly to our workshops YouTube playlist. So you don't need to sort through the whole YouTube channel. And so with that, let's get going. Also, just a note, we are based in Southern California. So the principles that we talk about today when we talk about things like plant density or water features or things like that are going to be universal. The plants themselves are mostly going to be relevant for gardeners in especially Southern California, though lots of them are going to be relevant throughout most of the state. I would say if you are not in Southern California, just look any plants that we might discuss, or you might see images of up, and make sure that they are appropriate for your area. And so with that, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the organization that I come from. We are the Waterwise Community Center. We are formally known as the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. We are a special district, so similar to a school district or a fire district. We are a small government agency that was formed by a public vote in 1949 to provide water conservation services to the western edge of San Bernardino County in Southern California. So we don't actually provide anybody's drinking water or water to their house. Those services are done by other local water agencies. We work very closely with our local retail agencies, though, on water conservation. And we do that in a few ways. We work on the supply side of water conservation through percolation. As you can see here on the right, we own and operate a series of large-scale percolation basins, which we manage for groundwater recharge. Our local area is very fortunate. About 60% of our local water supply comes from groundwater. That's pretty rare for Southern California. And so part of what we do is we maintain, and in coordination with other water agencies, operate a number of these large, literally holes in the ground that fill up with water when it rains, as they capture water that would otherwise leave our urban systems. We also sometimes work with other water agencies to further recharge the groundwater basin with imported, when it's available, water, as well as recycled water. But we also work on the supply, the demand side of water conservation, because it doesn't do that much to only be working on the supply if we're not using water wisely in our homes, businesses, and communities. And in our area, especially in the single family home, which is a lot of the water demand in our service area, about 60% of the water supply on average that goes to single family homes is used outdoors in the landscape, often on lawns that aren't even used, and people don't get that much out of it. And so in that aim, we demonstrate and we educate. We have a beautiful public demonstration garden with lots of plants, plant labels, and information. That's at our headquarters in Montclair, about 3 acres of demonstration landscapes of different Waterwise styles, lots of California native plants as well. So I encourage you to come check that out if you're in the area. And we do lots of free education as well, everything from field trip, curriculum integrated field trips for K through 12 students to free public workshops like this. We do lots of in-person workshops in our demonstration garden. We had those on hold due to COVID for almost a couple of years, but we are very excited to be doing fully outdoor demonstrations and classes again in our demonstration garden. And we also do professional training as well as all sorts of other programs. The easiest way to stay up to date and learn more about what we do is to sign up for our newsletter. You don't get a bunch of junk. We don't share your email with anybody else. It's just 1 email a month with all of our program and workshop updates. I encourage everybody to sign up if you don't get it already. And I'm typing that link into the chat right now, cbwc.org/newsletter. You can also check out our main website for more information about our program, cbwcd.org. Okay, and so with that, let's get closer into it. So who am I and why am I talking to you about this? So for those of you who have just joined us, my name is Scott Kleinerock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center. I am also a gardening and horticulture nut, you could say. I have been working in many aspects of this field for about 16 years now, I think. And that's included everything from landscape maintenance to design. I have a master's degree in landscape architecture. Before I came to work at the Waterwise Community Center, I worked doing design, construction management, and horticulture management in the public gardens world, botanical garden world for 8 years. But all through that, really my favorite thing is always just sort of reimagining what we can do with the normal spaces in our lives. I grew up in Van Nuys, Southern California, kind of suburb of Los Angeles, very typical to most of the suburbs within the Waterwise Community Center's service area. Currently, I live in a typical 1950s tract house in Pomona. And I've just always been really interested in why we make the choices that we do in terms of how we build the world around us. And one of the most malleable parts of that we can choose to do more interesting things with is what we do in the landscapes around us. And there is so much more we can do other than the typical turf landscape. And so I've spent a lot of my professional life first really focused on urban agriculture and edible gardens, but the last many years really focusing on native gardens, habitat, and this kind of exploring what we can do in our front yard and backyard spaces to contribute to the world. And a lot of that has to do with how we can build gardens that are not only beautiful places for us, but really support the ecosystem and provide meaningfully for the other creatures that call our neighborhoods home, specifically thinking about birds, butterflies, pollinators, lizards, and other critters. So this is one of my favorite workshops to teach, and I'm really excited to get into that with you. Before we do that, I'm going to put a quick opening poll up for you to tell me just a little bit about yourself. Please fill that out quickly, just 4 questions. That gives us some tracking metrics that we need to be able to do our program reports to make sure that we can keep offering this free service. And then I'll briefly tell you about how to ask questions and interact with me, and then we will jump into it. Okay, about a quarter of you are done. Just a moment more. Thank you very much, everybody. For those of you joining us from other communities, other than the ones that are listed, please let us know in the chat. Everyone's very welcome. We have West Hollywood, Queens, San Francisco, Portland, Florida, San Francisco Bay. So in the Bay Area, a lot of these plants will be applicable, but not quite all of them. There are a number of incredible native plant nurseries all around the Bay Area, Santa Rosa as well. So you can take what we're talking about today and check in with your local nurseries. Southern California, Huntington Beach, yeah, this is a lot of it's going to be the same. Have Texas, DC, San Francisco, Hollywood, Hawaii, all over the place. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, for those of you coming from farther away areas, you'll get a nice little glimpse of what it's like doing habitat gardening in Southern California. Welcome, everybody. It's your first time joining us. And if you haven't been able to finish the poll, don't worry about it. I think this is good enough. And let's get going. So, how to ask questions. Because we have a pretty large group, we have 77 people in the webinar right now. I don't do where people will raise their hands and then I call on them and then they turn their audio on, and find that there's a lot of downtime and technical issues with that. So the best way to ask me questions is you will see in your Zoom interface that there is a button you can press with 2 little text bubbles that says Q&A. If you want to ask questions, which I encourage you to do, please type it into that Q&A function. For me, that's very different than the chat on the back end on the screen that you can't see. That keeps all of the questions very well organized for me, and I can kind of check them off when I answer them. So that's the best way to do the Q&A or for questions. And to kind of keep the flow going, what I'm going to do is I'll work through a topic, and then I'll stop and look at all the questions that have come in related to that, and then kind of get caught up with all of the questions. Feel free to type the questions in at any time because it'll just log them for me. The questions that I'll have time to answer as we go will be more about the topic that we are specifically talking about. If you have questions that are more about your specific situation at home or on a project, I'm happy to answer as many of those as I can, but I might need to hold some of those until the end. And then I'm happy to stay until afternoon to be able to answer all of those. If you have comments at any point in time, feel free to type those into the chat. I look at all of those at the end as well. But the just general comments are best in the chat because they won't then bog down the efficient Q&A. And so question already came into the Q&A. I might as well answer. Joyce lives in the semi-desert area of British Columbia. Will the webinar information be adaptable? The general principles, yes. Individual plants, no, but we do talk a lot about general principles. So there will definitely be things that you can apply. Okay, so with that, here is our plan for today. We're going to first talk about why garden for birds, butterflies, pollinators, and other critters, and the big philosophical gardening ideas about why habitat gardening in some ways is not only useful to the earth, but actually more fun and in some ways easier to be successful with than traditional gardening. We'll look a little bit about what it might look like, at least here in Southern California. And then we will talk about the key elements of habitat gardening, which are most kind of at their most fundamental level: water, landscape structure, and plants. There's other things that we'll talk about as we go, but those are some of the big ones. We'll talk a little bit about design inspiration, and then we'll end with kind of, for Southern California gardeners, a bit of a field guide of the most common backyard birds, bees, butterflies, and plants that you are likely to see once you start habitat gardening. And some of it is very simple. I mean, it even starts with, for some of the birds, just having a good source of fresh, clean water as you are working on your plants, and it will already often transform who comes to your yard and who you are supporting. So I always like to start this class out by telling you about my morning, because truly in a habitat garden, every morning is different. And so what I always do is I spend some time out in my garden with my camera that morning. And then at the beginning of my day, I update the slideshow. So here in inland Southern California, late February, we actually are in the middle of a little bit of a cold snap. And my backyard it's in Pomona, but it's a little bit of a cold microclimate. So as opposed to the last time that I taught this class, late winter, early spring, when I first looked out in my yard, there actually wasn't that much going on. I normally see more bird activity the morning before I teach this workshop. And when I was wondering why, I went outside and looked, and it was partially because a lot of my good bird activity in the morning is around the bird baths that we have. And by bird baths, most of them are literally just ceramic saucers on top of logs, which works very well. And in fact, just as well or better than most like fancier, more expensive bird baths. But they were all frozen over. So I broke the ice, not frozen solid, but enough that they weren't going to be functioning. I broke the ice. It was a lovely morning. Took some pictures of some of the more habitat focused areas of the backyard. I have a pretty big backyard for suburban Southern California. Total lot size is about 1/3 of an acre in a weird wedge shape. That's why my partner and I bought this property. And so here are some of the habitat sections of our backyard. We also have fruit trees and veggie beds. And then I kind of went inside and let things warm up a little bit. And I always get a nice early detection of when things are starting to get interesting in the yard, because I have guards that like to monitor all of the windows. All of the life that comes to our backyard is an endless source of amusement and interest for our cats, who don't get to go outside because we bring a lot of birds to our yard. And it's not the cat's fault. I love cats, but they are voracious predators, whether or not they need to eat the local wildlife. And so they stay inside, but they get to enjoy lots and lots of activity. And so this is on top of our washing machine. We do some of our best bird watching from inside, out of this window, in our laundry room. We actually keep binoculars in there most of the time. So they alerted me to the fact that there's some more stuff starting to go on outside. And the early morning often starts the same way. We have this young-ish, but getting to be, it's probably close to 30 feet tall. It's grown a lot in the last couple of years. Coast live oak tree. If you're in Southern California, if you're interested in habitat and you have room for an oak tree, plant an oak tree. The kind of default one to go with in most cases would be a coast live oak tree. It will change what happens in your yard. And so oftentimes there'll be 6 or 7 different species of birds in this one tree. And what happens is in the morning, we start seeing different birds darting out from the tree, starting their days. And what'll happen is they'll dart from the tree into a different part of the yard. And then sometimes if they get spooked, they'll dart back. And kind of this back and forth little commute out of the oak tree to other parts of the yard, and sometimes into neighbors' yards, starts to happen. And so that was starting up. And so I started to get some bird pictures. Hummingbird was all over the place that morning, probably because it's cold. Hummingbird has to get going and keep warm. And so I get a lot of pictures resting on our electrical drop cables. So have our hummingbird, and then we have some warblers in town right now. They are seasonal visitors to our garden. And so this particular one was one of the first ones out exploring around the yard. Mockingbirds, after the morning gets going, are currently really in their mating calls, starting to try to pair up for the season. Not a great picture, but we get a mockingbird at the very top of this oak tree, kind of king of the hill all of the time, calling out. And warblers were definitely the first ones out today. So this is in a mule fat bush, which is a great habitat plant, also provides us lovely shade, not a common one for home gardeners, but an incredible habitat plant and very easy to grow. And then the bird baths started to become active. And so after kind of waiting around, around about 8:15, things were warm enough that all of a sudden all of the life came, and I was wanting to take pictures, but also realizing I needed to get into the office and get ready for this presentation. So here you could see a house finch, who are common visitors to our yards, seed eaters. So they like a lot of the seeds that our native plants grow, and common at the bird bath, was having a good time, and this warbler was getting a little bit impatient. And I didn't realize until right now that it looks like the goldfinch is actually sticking it. I'm sorry, the house finch is actually sticking its tongue out at it. So waiting line for bird baths sometimes is always interesting, especially when multiple species are sharing. And then goldfinches started to come out. Goldfinches, we normally have flocks and flocks of them. There weren't as many early this morning. Probably by now in our garden, it's full of them. First goldfinch out in a still dormant desert willow. And bush tits, which are tiny, very quick moving birds, which are hard to photograph, but adorable and have the highest pitched little peeps, were active through some of the bushes, gathering little seeds. And actually there is a couple of them which look like they're starting to build a nest in a big grapefruit tree we have. And then just blooms. The European honeybees were out. It was still a little chilly in the morning for the native bees. I'm sure they'll be out later today. But one of the things that we work with intentionally with habitat gardening is having blooms of different native plants for as much of the year as possible to provide for the critters that want either nectar or pollen for as much of the year as possible. So blooms year round. And just to kind of quickly show you, it really changes throughout the year, the different blooms and the birds. So this is the last time I taught the class in September. My morning there, hummingbirds, goldfinches, lots of seeds around, native bumblebees, mockingbird on top of the oak tree still. Black phoebe is around in the afternoons, catching insects a lot these days. Lots of goldfinches and native pollinators. And then the last time I taught this class in February of last year, we had towhee, who will be around later, hopping around on the ground eating seeds, warblers, hummingbirds, sparrows, bluebirds, goldfinches, and white-crowned sparrows, who I saw this morning but wasn't able to capture. So that's just an average day in a Southern California yard that does habitat gardening. And it literally is, if you build it, they will come. I have seen the most interesting insects and birds show up, like even in gardens in downtown LA, as soon as they're doing something interesting with the gardening. So really, for most of you, you can, in fact, do this. So why would we garden for wildlife habitat? Well, one of the big ideas is it is something that we actually can do. If we have a small plot of land, and that could be whether or not you own your house, whether you rent, and your landlord's going to let you do some gardening, which has been my situation for most of the time I've been doing habitat gardening. My yard right now is the first one that I've owned. It can be if you live in an apartment and only have room for a couple of potted plants on a balcony. It could be at your place of business, or it could be advocating for it in your local parks. Like, for example, right now, where I live in Pomona, they're doing a parks master plan and asking the community what they want to see in parks going forward. Perfect chance to advocate for having some of the space in parkland be native habitat focused plants. There are so many environmental issues right now that just seem so huge and so hard to figure out if and how we can make a difference. This is something that not only we can do, but you see the results instantly. You put the plants in the ground and you see the stuff showing up and using that resource that they truly need. Douglastalamay is an author from the Northeast, but he writes a lot of books about generally the importance of people gardening for habitat. I like this quote of his. It's becoming increasingly clear that much of our wildlife will not be able to survive unless food, shelter, and nest sites can be found in suburban habitats. There's just a lot of suburbs that have been built over the past 50, 75 years now. And there's a lot of habitat that's been lost. And interestingly, we are going to be using resources where we live. And so to be able to use fewer resources than a conventional landscape and have these dense pockets of habitat for not all wildlife will be able to live there, but for the wildlife that can, is an incredible thing. I have more, for example, native bird diversity and concentration in my yard than most places where I'll be in a similarly sized square foot area when I'm out on a hike. And that's not to say that wildland management isn't absolutely and a hugely important part of it, but doing both really, really can help, and we can help do it. Habitat is still in decline, and we can help provide for it. In our local area, there are still undeveloped landscapes that provide habitat for wildlife, which are in the process of being turned into suburbs. Some of them are ones where if native gardens and habitat-focused gardens are planted, whether it's in an old suburb or a new one, certainly it doesn't solve all of the issue, but it helps reduce the impact. One example that there is a lot about in the news are the declines of monarch butterflies. And in Southern California, our native, easiest to grow habitat support plant for monarch butterflies is narrowleaf milkweed specifically. It has many advantages over the more common in horticulture tropical milkweed for our monarchs. And it truly is, if you plant it, they will come often the first year. If not by the second year, you will have tons and tons of monarch caterpillars and butterflies in most areas in Southern California if you put it into the ground. And that's also beneficial for us. It gets us in touch with the wider world. It kind of gets us out of our extremely human-centric frame of mind, which is really easy to slip into going through the kind of day-to-day of our work and family lives. And it really, I feel, adds a whole other very valuable dimension to our lives. I have no doubt that for me, it really has benefits for my mental health and general morale as well. It's really, really fascinating, and it gets us in touch with this wider world that's very interesting and educational. And so whether it's for you, your kids, your grandkids, or all of it, you don't need to go out to nature. Getting out into the mountains, which is our kind of local wilderness, is irreplaceable, but we can't always do that all of the time. But in a typical suburban front yard and or backyard, we can have elements of it, and we can still have our patios and our outdoor dining areas and our kitchens. But if we surround that with native plants, we can even still have lawns. But if we take a portion of our yard at least and provide for that, we will see all sorts of interesting things, not only just the life itself, but the cycle. So for example, if you live in Southern California and you do this sort of gardening, you will begin to learn, for example, that the white-crowned sparrows spend their summers up in the mountains, but then when it gets cold up there, they winter down here in our gardens. And so literally, no matter what the calendar says, in my yard, fall starts when the white-crowned sparrows show up. And there's so many other different cycles that you'll learn about, from what butterflies show up when, to the birds, to the insect life cycles, to just the flowers and how they change. And every year is a little bit different. It's fascinating. I already talked about the fact that it is literally therapeutic, but that's actually been studied, and views out of windows into the studies often say, like, quote, natural situations. And that's a bit of a loaded term, but kind of views out into natural aesthetic sort of garden literally can reduce stress, as well as many, many other kind of nice things. Definitely more so than staring out into a neglected, unused lawn that needs to be mowed either by you or by someone else who you're going to pay to use, stinky, polluting equipment to do that. And if you have a lawn that you use, that's not to say that you should feel bad for having it, but I encourage people to think about how much they use and how much they want to maintain and what they can do with their other square footage. And so all of this together creates a garden that you actually want to spend time in. And then when you or someone has to do garden care, it's more enjoyable, which kind of magically makes that easier. It's quieter in Southern California. Most of the plants are low maintenance and only need to be touched once or maybe twice a year. And most of that is in the spring or in the fall when it's actually much more pleasant to be outside. And summer is a pretty quiet period, actually, where you just get to mostly enjoy what's going on, maybe do a little bit of weeding if you need to, but not a lot of heavy maintenance. Most of the plants are going to be low water for where you are, because they are going to be native plants that generally are pretty well adapted to where you are. And just because it's native to your state doesn't always mean it is low water. It might be something that grows next to a creek, but you learn and kind of research that as you go. But it's really easy to choose the perfect plants that do this and are very well adapted. Down here in Southern California, most of these plants that I'm going to show get a deep watering once a week in their first year or so when they're getting established. And then oftentimes only about once a month after that in the months that it doesn't rain. Depending on your soils, might be once every 3 weeks, but not that much at all. And so basically, pull this all together so we can do something that's good for the planet, that makes your property a more beautiful, enjoyable space, saves a ton of water and resources versus a conventional landscape. Seems like a no-brainer to consider. And so one of my ideas is that this can be a new sort of default landscape for Southern California, meaning if we don't have anything better to do with that space, why not have a beautiful landscape that supports the earth and is low maintenance and low resource? And then for other areas, there might be a reason to do something other than that default. I grow fruit trees. I love growing vegetables. Not all of my yard is this native habitat garden, but my default where I don't have veggie beds or fruit trees is that. Some people might love heirloom roses, so you can have your rose garden of whatever size you want. And then maybe stuff like this could be the default. And I like a very wild style. You'll see that in a lot of my pictures. That is kind of the most beneficial for habitat, but you can use locally appropriate native plants and have a more formal aesthetic or less density and still get many, many of the habitat benefits. So one of the best parts about all of this is that it is not all or nothing. And you don't necessarily need to start from scratch. If you have, for example, in Southern California, medium water use trees that are well established, like a beautiful magnolia, you don't need to tear it out to only plant low water native plants. There's plenty of other plants that will be compatible with that kind of more medium water use that you can mix in that same area. And you could start a bit at a time with some potted plants or just in one planting bed or just along the edge of a fence or something, and add other elements over time if it's best for you. You don't need to do it all at once. So for the average person, how doable is this really? Well, if you build it, they will come. That's one of my mantras. It is absolutely, absolutely doable. So this is our backyard in December 2018. The backyard had been neglected for decades, and we basically had to clear out everything except a few trees that we could save and start from scratch. And somebody gave us this little mini concrete bird bath, which we put up on top of just a cinder block to elevate it a little bit more. And with this, just changing the water out in this bird bath every day, it was incredible what bird life started showing up, just because they learned that that was a constant source of clean, fresh water. And it had already kind of started even before we got any native plants into the ground. It is very doable. And part of the importance, and this is the kind of ecological theory part of it, and then we'll get very practical. Part of the importance and the reason why what we do in our yards matters is because of these ideas of nodes, connectivity, and our communities. So in most of Southern California, the actual like what hills and what mountains it is changes, but much of Southern California looks kind of like this. We have large urban and suburban areas. In the flat areas, whether it's more coastal in the city or in the valleys. And then we have mountains and hills, which originally were hard to develop, still would be hard to develop, but at different times got preserved. So here in our local community, our Waterwise Community Center is right around here. And we have the San Gabriel Mountains to the north and Chino Hill State Park to the south. And then this is Prado Basin and Prado Wetlands. And then we get into Corona and Orange County farther south. And so we have a huge amount of habitat up here. We have some down here. There are still sometimes connectivity issues, but what we do in our yards are these linkages in between. And so essentially, some animals need a constant connectivity. So that's like mountain lions. There are a lot in the news in Southern California because they've lost the connectivity that they need to be able to walk across safely to be able to do what they need to do. But other animals, especially the ones that are more mobile, like birds and insects, can use what are called nodes. So those are little spots that might be scattered in between wider areas of habitat that can provide for certain species that can be adapted to these small nodes, meaningful spaces for food, for nesting, for shelter. And so the more of these individual nodes that we have in between these larger open and managed wild spaces, the greater we can support not only the habitat right that we see in our yard, but kind of the larger system. So what we collectively do makes a difference in addition to what we individually do. And so here is just an example of me trying to get this going in our neighborhood, I guess you could say. Here's the Waterwise Community Center. This is one node. This is our demonstration gardens. This is basically where I live. That's another node. Not a whole lot of native habitat in between. If any of you live in this area and you have a native garden in this area, let me know. I'll add it to this list. Yeah, the more of these throughout our neighborhood, it kind of has a multiplying effect to then be able to support all of this habitat. So what each of us do really does make a difference, even if it's only a couple of shrubs. And so how is this different than conventional gardening? There are some significant differences in terms of what you would do and the philosophy. That part of it is about choosing the right plants. And if you want to leave it there and just choose native plants, that's already a big step. But when we look at conventional gardening, it's really just concerned about what your yard looks like. The garden is essentially an outdoor decoration, and ideally plants are like sculpture, perfectly in bloom all year, or as close to that as possible. And we spend a lot of time, effort, money, fertilizer, water, etc., manipulating the space to keep it as close as possible to this like glossy magazine picture version of the garden at the peak of spring is what most people think. Changes and disturbances to that might take us on detours from having that perfect garden vision are most often just a frustration, and we work super hard to eliminate them and get back to that original idea, sometimes planting the same plant in the same place over and over again, or we get frustrated. Ecological gardening is very different, and in my opinion, both much more interesting and much easier. With the framework of ecological gardening, every yard or garden is a living ecosystem. It's not just about the visual. It's not just about a snapshot or a picture. And these gardens are very beautiful, but that's just really a minimum. There is so much going on in an ecological garden that you can never take a picture of all of those processes. You can never capture it all in Instagram, which is kind of beautiful. You have to be there and you kind of have to be in the moment to appreciate it all. In an ecological garden, we value the fact that complex webs of relationships exist between plants, animals, and the microorganisms in the soil, the fungus and the bacteria, which oftentimes people just think about in terms of disease. Most of those microorganisms usually help us out. They're processing nutrients in the soil, among other things, and creating an environment where it's harder for the pathogens to negatively affect our plants. To really understand all of this in terms of an ecological science perspective is pretty complicated, and the science is really developing every year on it. But we don't really need to understand it all. We just kind of need to acknowledge the fact that all of these relationships exist. And when we get to observe them and notice patterns, that can be helpful to us. We are not necessarily the controlling hand to beat this garden into shape to a singular vision. Primarily, we can see ourselves as a steward instead, which means that we are definitely in the mix. We're creating interventions. We are putting plants out. We are often at the beginning, creating a planting design or deciding what plants to put in. But then we're seeing how things respond. We're observing. We're taking it from there. Unexpected and delightful things happen pretty constantly, especially when you start working with things like annual wildflowers that then you let dry out, some to be bird food, and then the birds scatter the seeds. And these surprising things start to happen. Sometimes you need to do some editing or removing, but oftentimes we end up with a more beautiful garden than we could ever plan. And there's just something spontaneous and delightful to some of those things. Setbacks often lead to new discoveries. If a plant dies where you put it, and you know that you have researched what the plant wants, kind of the conditions, the irrigation, the light, and it just doesn't thrive there, then maybe you'll retry the plant again. But it's not about just putting that same plant in over and over again and getting frustrated. It's about kind of thinking about what's going on there. Is there something else? Is there maybe a different plant to try instead that's going to be more adapted? And through this kind of framework, which is very different than conventional gardening, everything is just sort of interesting. You're taking it all in, and you end up with a much more beautiful and much more magical landscape than most conventional gardens, which will take a lot more work and resources. It's more laid back, it's more fun, and it's more effective. And it's much easier to be successful. We are embracing the change of the seasons. And that means that in July, when it's 110 degrees during a heat wave, it doesn't need to look like springtime. And kind of those glossy magazines or sometimes Instagram gardens, I can tell you, they don't look like that all year round. And in all of those gardens, there's always something dying or not working, but the professional photographers just aren't taking pictures of it. So you can kind of, instead of tapping into just that visual part of it, you can enjoy the visual part of it, but kind of the whole system is really, really where the beauty is. So wildlife gardening takes on that framework and does it while intentionally providing for food, cover, and water as some of the basics for the critters that we want to provide homes for. And that deals with plants, but that also deals with other things in the landscape. It helps provide permanent homes for the species that want permanent homes in our yard, as well as connectivity or corridors for the many species which might stop along the way. So in our yard, when there are butterfly migrations at different times of years that go kind of all throughout the region of different species, those butterflies will linger in our landscapes at my work garden and at my home garden for longer, kind of getting nectar, kind of recharging some than I see at other landscapes in the community. And then they will be on their ways. And that's just a magical thing that sometimes happens every year. Some years are heavier, some years are less, depending on other conditions going out in the wider world. But it's awesome to know that our yards are contributing to helping those butterflies migrate hundreds of miles or more. So what might that look like? Well, here's just some examples. This is an example that I show in a lot of my workshops. So if you've been in my other workshops, you might have seen it before. This is a front yard landscape in Pasadena that I took pictures of on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And this is a very beautiful DIY designed and installed native front yard landscape with a lot of habitat value. Big swath of local native California buckwheat with some very showy coastal sunflowers, ceanothus and white sage. Will have blooms a lot of the year, from the ceanothus in the spring to the California buckwheat in the late summer and fall, and a number of other things going on. But still, there's a nice kind of mix between wild, but also using some kind of conventional landscape approaches. There's some layering, there's accent shrub, there's repetition of the California buckwheat in the front. So it's not just one of this, one of that all throughout. And then there's a nice, generous, probably about 3 feet wide for in the main area, gravel pathway to be able to get through and enjoy the garden and allow guests to comfortably walk up to the house and do the maintenance. Here is our backyard at less than 1 year old. So you saw a different section of the backyard off to the left when there was nothing there. This was all planted from 1 gallon, kind of tiny 1 gallon plants, including our desert willow tree. And so this is at less than 1 year old, starting to grow in. And this is it at about, I want to say about 2 years old. I didn't put the dates on. And this is actually during a heat wave and when there were wildfires going on that turned the sky gray. And so you can see by selecting plants local native to your area, especially in Southern California, we can have things that bloom all throughout the year. So things like the sages are really floriferous in the spring and early summer. And then the buckwheats, you can see a number of different buckwheats here, California buckwheat, Lysanum buckwheat, are really floriferous when it's really, really hot in the late summer, early fall, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff kind of constantly going on. And so here's just some other pictures from other parts of our yard. We have a system that we set up, which is a series of dry stream beds that then, if there's a big rain event, will go to this little sunken meadow area, which will absorb any additional water. And so we have it set up where we have a little broken concrete bench of just stuff from projects in the yard that was left over, this kind of raised area. This is a native mule fat, which is a semi-riparian, grows in wet areas, but it's a very drought tolerant tree that just doesn't get direct irrigated much, but has its roots into some areas with the fruit trees that get irrigated. This is green most of the year, but it's been frosty lately. So it's going to be getting cut back a little bit later in the season. And this is a lovely cooler spot where we have a water feature that I'll talk about later that sets up a kind of different microclimate. This is the bush that I showed you with one of the warblers in it that I photographed this morning. So this is just from like last week in my garden. So maybe about a little less than 3 years after planting. And then again, here's our cats looking out into our yard. So this was what was going on right in front of the window the other day. Goldfinches really love anything related to sunflowers, and they will sit in the bush or on this is an annual sunflower, and hang upside down and eat every little seed they can for months and months and months. It always starts small. So in our California Native Garden Design class that we have coming up soon that we'll be teaching online as well, I use my front yard as a case study. But in case you will not be joining us for that one, I encourage you to. It's really useful to take on that class and this one at the same time as you're planning your habitat garden. But here is our front yard after planting in March 2019. Again, all 1 gallon tiny plants. And here is it at 5 months. Resident hummingbird moving in, decided it wanted to spend almost every morning hanging out on this California fescue. And here it is at about 6 months. So things will get going. We chose to get our yard certified as a wildlife habitat. The wildlife doesn't care if you have the certification, but that's something that you can do with a small donation to the National Wildlife Federation. It's just kind of like a little form you fill out where you self-certify that you have features that provide food, water, cover, and places to raise young, which if you're kind of doing the stuff we're talking about, you will. And then you get this cool little sign. And so our front yard is the first one in our neighborhood to look like this. And so this little sign lets people visiting our yard know what's going on here. And it continuing to grow in. This is about 13 months from an elevated point of view of our front yard habitat garden. See, mixing in little bits of rock, mixing in some pieces of wood as well, really help provide for all sorts of different critters that we want around and helps provide for that cycle. Here's another example of a beautiful kind of native and habitat focused front yard that I drove by the other day in Rancho Cucamonga. I knocked on the door, no one was home, so hopefully they don't mind me using pictures, but absolutely lovely naturalistic yard with all sorts of native plants that bloom throughout the year, nice little shaded seating area. And you see in front yards that have all of this, there's so much going on. People want to spend time out there and end up spending more time out in the front yard than they did in oftentimes the conventional landscapes or lawns that they replaced. Great social spaces. Here is a front yard that I designed that was a DIY project put in by the homeowner in Ontario, Southern California. Native garden with some water harvesting and some nice habitat features. Okay, a couple of questions, and then we'll start going one by one through the key elements. From Jessica, can I share the website to get the certified wildlife habitat? If you just Google certified wildlife habitat, I'm sure it will come up. I don't know the actual URL. I've never had to write it down because I think I always just Google certified wildlife habitat. And I can go back to the image really quickly. So it's from the National Wildlife Federation. Oh, there you go, nwf.org/garden. It's actually on the sign that I walk by multiple times a day, every day. Okay, other question. Okay, there's a specific question from Margarita about trees. I'll have to hold that till the end. And then from Claudia about bird baths. We'll talk about bird baths in just a second and kind of my recommendations. So like I mentioned, just putting out the bird bath is a great place to start, and the birds will start to learn that your site is a great place for fresh water. And then as the plants grow in, it'll just get even better. All life needs fresh, clean water, and it can be hard to find. And it's also hilarious to watch birds bathe. They splash around. They sometimes wait their turn. They sometimes don't. Here, you notice that with this one, it's still elevated on top of the cinder block, but we use some stone and broken concrete to sort of surround it and make it look nicer. And lizards love to hang out on that as well. So I didn't even realize this when I was taking the picture, but here we have a Western fence lizard sunning itself while all the birds bathe, and they splash around. Bird baths, my general recommendations are, if you're going to have one bird bath, just make it something that's easy to clean. This concrete one was given to us, so that's why we use it. It does take quite a bit of scrubbing in the summer to make sure there's not algae on it, but bird baths, the most important thing with bird baths is you have to keep them clean. So make sure that they're convenient to where you can clean them out with a hose, because birds, while awesome and very intelligent in their own ways, have no decency and will poop in their own water that they also want to bathe in and drink. And there are certain diseases that can also be communicated from bird to bird to bird, and we want to prevent that. So with a bird bath, highly recommend that every morning just becomes part of your ritual, or afternoon, or any time of day that's going to work for you. But once a day, you tip the water out of the bird bath and you replace it with fresh, clean water. If you're going to be leaving town for multiple days, just empty out the bird bath. And then every few days to minimum once a week, plan on giving your bird baths a good scrub. And the best thing to do for scrubbing out your bird baths, and it's very inexpensive, is get like a chemical spray bottle from the hardware store, and you can do a 10% bleach solution roughly. So a little bit of bleach, about 10%, and the rest water, and spraying that and just using a little scrub brush is very, very effective at sanitizing your bird baths, and very cheap, and doesn't leave any like lingering smells of cleaners or anything else like that the birds don't like. So that's bird bath sanitation. So that being said, a bird bath that's easy to tip the water out on a daily basis is my favorite recommendation for bird baths. Now, if you're going to do multiple bird baths, I think in our backyard, we started with 2, and then we got more and more and more. I think we have 7, probably, if I counted them all out, in our kind of large backyard that we clean out daily. So it takes a while, but it's kind of like this ritual that also gets us out into the garden. My partner and I do every other day, gets us out into the garden, enjoying the garden every morning, or sometimes afternoon if the bird baths are frozen when we are leaving for work. And so this one is one, but most of our bird baths kind of look more like this. They're just the ceramic saucers that would be underneath like a fancy ornamental pot. And if you're going to use a terracotta one, you want a very dense terracotta. Usually the Italian terracotta is denser. And that's because the more porous it is, the more algae wants to grow and the harder it is to keep clean. The best ceramics for it are actually the colorful glazed ones, but those are sometimes more expensive, and we just happen to have access to some really cheap terracotta ones. So we still scrub them out when we need to. Sometimes they get kind of stained. You know, you're not going to get them perfectly clean, but it's not anything that's living. And the birds absolutely love them. They love to perch on the sides. Some of them we have up on stumps. Some of them we have on kind of broken concrete more towards the ground level. If you have a lot of stray cats in your area, there's always going to be some. Elevated is a little safer for the birds. I always used to only use elevated bird baths, but then the more I kind of observed, a lot of the smaller bird species actually do all of their hunting for seeds on the ground. Goldfinches will be in bushes often, but there's other species that are they don't go up into bushes. They don't really go up high. They're comfortable on the ground. And those species actually prefer to usually bathe closer to the ground as well. So you just kind of have to know your situation. But it's good to have a tree or a dense shrub kind of nearby if you can have that, and easy access to a hose so that the birds can kind of safely go from the bird bath into a sheltered area if they need to. But sometimes not too much density right around the bird bath is good as well, because that allows them to kind of see right around their bathing area and make sure that nothing is like hiding right there. So some kind of bird bath tips. If you are going to have multiple bird baths and you have the ability to have different sizes and different depths of bird baths, that will be appealing to different kinds of birds. So that's kind of starting simple. Birds also really do quite like, especially the larger ones, kind of a larger water feature. And some birds really do like moving water. So this is a pot that I turned into a water feature that kind of just goes over the sides down into a gravel base that's on top of a hidden little like pre-made plastic vault that I was able to get. This is my parents' backyard, and this is in Van Nuys, Southern California. And some of the smaller local hawks really like to perch on it and get a drink of water, where hawks occasionally will see them in like a saucer bird bath, but not as much. So some of this are things that I already mentioned. Also, if you change your bird bath water daily, you will never have to worry about mosquitoes. That's a common question that I get, and it's very important to be aware of. You don't want to be creating mosquito habitat. And so the mosquito life cycle to go from an egg to a aquatic larva to actually a flying mosquito that could bite and potentially spread disease takes 72 hours. And the mosquito larvae are very fragile. So if you're cleaning your bird bath water out every day, or even if you miss a day, but you get back to it the next day and you tilt out that water, that will kill any larvae that were in that bird bath. And so that constant cleaning is going to help you out. For the recirculating ones, if there is enough water flow, because the mosquito larvae like calm water, they can't deal with a lot of flow or movement, then that will probably take care of what you need. So sometimes like those overflowing water features, that larva won't be able to live in that. If you have something where it's a little bit more calm, depending on the feature, either mosquito fish or using a product called Dunks, which has a bacteria extract that disrupts the life cycle of the mosquito larva, are different options. If it is something that mosquito fish can live in, that is generally what I will go with. And those are some, some general kind of guidelines. If you also are interested in supporting butterflies, bees, and other insects, you can experiment with, in your saucers or water features, have some stones, or in a saucer or shallow bird bath, sand or gravel with the water. Those can be ideal for butterflies, bees, and other small insects that would kind of get washed into sometimes a larger, more open bird bath. Being able to land on a rock, or for butterflies, sip water from out between the particles of sand, is really useful, more comfortable, and less dangerous for them. It does make cleaning a bit more involved, though, and it really depends. Sometimes I've set those up and they work really well. Sometimes kind of no one really comes to them. In our current yard, when we have set up the kind of saucers with sand and gravel and other stuff like that, they're not used that much because there are plenty of other just areas that have evolved in the garden that will meet those needs. And so we generally just have bird baths, some with a few rocks in the water feature. But I encourage you to experiment and figure out what's going to work best for your yard. So here's another perfect example. Ceramic saucer, you can see the one rock here, just on a log. If you don't have logs, you can do something like this. This was what I created in a past place I lived, with just some old 4x4 lumber. And this was on top of, at the hardware store, you can get, it's like almost like a trapezoid of concrete with a couple of metal straps poured into it that can screw into a 4x4 just to prop that up. I will say that if you're going to do something like that, I highly encourage you to put more blocking around it so that it's more stable. This one, I lost this one time because a squirrel jumped onto it. The birds didn't weigh enough to knock this off, but the squirrel did. So definitely, however you want to do it, to have a nice solid platform on top. And yeah, if you know you have cats, again, don't put them in a place where cats can easily hide and pick them off. It's estimated that 2 to 4 million birds are killed by cats every day in the US. It is a huge issue. Cats are super efficient predators. I love cats. It's not their fault. If you have a cat, I highly encourage you to either keep the cat inside or to go out with you on a leash to enjoy the garden if you are going to do that. That might sound super weird to people who have never done that before, but I had a cat that we used to do that with, and as soon as he got used to it, he enjoyed it quite a bit. But yeah, if you're going to do this sort of stuff to where you're bringing a ton of birds to your yard, which is good, there are other responsibilities that come with it. And in addition to bird baths, it's also ideal to provide a source of moving, recirculating water. And there are easy ways to do that. It doesn't need to cost an arm and a leg. It can be done with a simple pump submerged in a container or overflowing into a pre-made vault, like I mentioned. And so that's the other product I mentioned, are dunks. If you're using mosquito fish, or if you need to get a hold of them, depending on where you live, the local vector control district often will bring them to you for free. So when I used to live in Altadena, when we started the water feature that I'm about to show you, we thought it was going to be enough water circulation to not have to deal with mosquitoes, but then we started to notice that there were some larvae. So we used dunks just to take care of it right away. But then we called the local vector control district, and they actually came out to us to look at the water feature and gave us a bag of mosquito fish to put in there, which have thrived. And then they just asked to be able to come back one more time to kind of check in on it. And I know that locally, where we are in the service area for Waterwise Community Center, the local vector control district as well, which is West Valley Vector Control District, does distribute mosquito fish for free. So you can call them up if you need some. And so this is the water feature. And this was our young and newly planted garden around it that we currently have for our larger recirculating one. I'm a big fan. It's just so easy and relatively simple, and for a water feature, relatively inexpensive to set up, which is just a stock tank. This one is about 2 feet wide by, I think, about 6 feet. This is one that we got for free. It was just kind of abandoned in the back of a place that we were renting. Filled it up with water, stuck in a very simple fountain pump with just a 1/2-inch irrigation riser on it. And there's just an extension cord that goes off the back of this where you can't see it. And it's just a heavy duty outdoor extension cord buried in the mulch. We know exactly where it is, so we are not going to accidentally stick a shovel through it or something like that. Some people, if it's a commercial style, or if you are really trying to kind of do everything for long-term safety, wouldn't be bad to put it in rigid electrical conduit. But realistically, we just have it with an extension cord in the mulch, and we are very careful when we do maintenance around there. It has never been an issue, and that just keeps the water going. And so in this, because it's a large enough volume, we have some milk crates and some bricks holding up some aquatic native plants. And that also creates shade and little bits of algae, which also help feed the mosquito fish. And between just the insects that land that the mosquito fish eat and the algae, we've never had to feed them, and they just kind of find their own balance, and things are great. Occasionally in the summer, before any shade grew in, we'd get a little too much algae on the surface, and I'd use just a little bit of it's a straw-derived pond cleaner that you can get as a liquid form, and you just put like a little capful in. You can get it at, I think, any big box hardware store. Definitely, if there's a local specialty pond supply store, they will have it. It's a little bit of a barley straw extract, but I've had to do that like twice. And other than that, it's just kind of found its balance. But having some plants in addition to the fish also definitely helps. And then when birds land, it gives them different choices of where to land. And so we see some of our larger birds, like our mourning doves that we have. They don't really like to use the larger bird baths. Occasionally they will, but mostly they'll use this. And then occasionally it gets really, really quiet in our yard, and we'll look outside and we'll see a hawk coming around, and they like to use the larger water features as well. And so these kind of galvanized troughs, you can get them at all sorts of different sizes as well. I think the largest selection in our local community is from, there's a chain of stores called Tractor Supply Company, and they stock a large assortment of these. And Home Depot lately has been carrying them as well in just a few sizes. So those would be places to check out for it. And the fountain pump, you don't need to get anything crazy. The one that we use costs about $35. The troughs cost a bit. This is, I think this one would have been, at the time that I looked it up, around $200, which is an investment. But again, for a water feature, that's still quite reasonable compared to other options. And so here you can see this is in the location of the first garden that we had it in, and there's just the extension cord coming up the back. And you can do it smaller as well. So this is another garden that I visited on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, which is coming up again in spring. It had been not in person for a couple of years due to COVID, but you should definitely check it out. It's more in the Los Angeles area. But if you check out nativeplantgardentour.org, you can get all of the information about it. And I go every year and take tons of photographs. It's a really great chance to see lots and lots of gardens with native plants and lots of habitat features. And so that's kind of just the basics on water. You can get creative. Some people get all the way into doing in-ground ponds with native pond plants and things like that. And those are incredible for habitat as well. Just a little bit more complicated, higher maintenance, and beyond kind of this more introductory kind of class. Okay, so let's see some questions that have come in. Is citronella safe for birds if you're trying to keep away yellow jackets and mosquitoes? I've never heard of using it in a bird bath, if that's what you're talking about. But in general, if it's like a candle or spraying some of the like natural mosquito repellents on yourself, yeah, that'll be fine. I wouldn't use it in a bird bath, though. I don't think it would necessarily harm the birds, but it'll be pretty funky. I don't think they would like it. Kayleen, for the saucers for insects, could you possibly apply rocks, et cetera, with silicone or something? You could dump the water without having to reset them after. That's a really interesting idea. I don't know. You could certainly try it. Certainly any silicone or anything that would be, for like a kitchen or bathroom surface that is, like safe food contact for people, would be safe for the bird bath. So try it and let us know. Okay, can I please recommend a plant to help with birds to take cover from the hawks when they wait by the fountain? Basically, that's kind of just structural. So any shrub native to your area, like medium size or large shrub native to your area, would be something to consider. And there are some general plant recommendations later on, but it's, there are so many different options that I don't want to necessarily recommend just one. Okay, from Mark, we have a large cement bird bath. Is there a sealer that would be safe to apply to minimize the algae that I might recommend? Good question. I am not sure. I would just, again, look for anything that would be considered like food and contact safe for people is kind of what I would be looking for. Okay. So other question, but I'll answer it right now. Might be applicable to other people. How do HOAs feel about native gardens? Depends on the HOA. So different HOAs have different specific guidelines for their landscape standards. Certainly, so HOAs can no longer require lawn. They cannot prevent someone from moving towards a Waterwise garden. However, they still can have their own standards for aesthetics. So depending on your HOA, the sorts of gardens that I'm showing might be fine, or they might be a little too wild. But you can still use the plants and the principles and maybe just have something in the front yard a little more orderly and then get as wild as you want in the back. So just look at the standards. Don't be afraid to kind of, push a little bit, but just make sure that you are meeting those standards that you can point back to if you are going to be proposing landscape changes or needing to defend them. And oftentimes they have to deal with leaving trees and a minimum amount of plant density or things like that. So, I would say feel free to gently push the boundaries, but make sure you're meeting the requirements. What about using gray water for irrigation? So gray water goes beyond the scope of this class, kind of a whole other topic. But for most native plants, if you have a gray water system where you can move the gray water outlet, that can work. Or if it's going to be constantly wet, having plants that are adapted to kind of semi like creekside conditions. So for example, if you're going to have a gray water system, and gray water is basically reusing water, kind of changing your plumbing, should be permitted for anything except the laundry where there's standard plans. But basically you're kind of repiping so that clean water, so mostly in most cases, it'd be either laundry water or shower water using biodegradable soaps, is going to go to your garden for irrigation instead. Something we should be thinking about these days because of our huge drought situation. So for example, you have to do your research. So yarrow, western meadow sedge, these are grasses that don't need a ton of water, but will always appreciate the extra water. You can have gray water permanently piped to them. Most native plants, though, don't want permanent wetness. They need a good dry down in between. Like I mentioned, after they're established, water about every 3 or 4 weeks, depending on where you are. But I have a gray water system where I am able to move the outlet. And so I do water some of my native plants with gray water, and I just move that outlet, back to them only every 3 to 4 weeks. So all depends. But yeah, there is potential for sure. Okay. So let's keep going. Lots to cover. And then we will take about a 5-minute break sometime between 10:30 and 11 as well. So that will be coming. Lots to cover still though. So now we're going to get into the next key element, which is landscape structure. And what I mean by that is overlapping tiers of vegetation. So if you're really trying to maximize the benefit for wildlife, you don't want what sometimes people do with a Waterwise garden, which is a sea of wood chip mulch, and then there's like one shrub over here, and then 5 feet of open wood chip mulch, and one shrub over there, and then 7 feet of open wood chip mulch, and another shrub over there. If you plant appropriately from those 1 gallon plants, like I mentioned, at the beginning, it will be that. But when you're coming up with where you're going to put your plants, you want to research the full sizes. And in most cases, have things relatively grown in by the time they reach their mature sizes. And then also not just thinking about the ground plane, but thinking about heights. And so you want trees, shrubs, and ground covers. And a tree might have a shrub or a ground cover underneath it. And so here's just one section of my backyard. The trees are quite young, just starting to grow in, but there will be a desert museum Palo Verde tree and a Western redbud, which is a California native large shrub, which can be slightly pruned up to make it into a small tree, which is what we're going to do. And then we have this higher level that has shrubs, as well as a lot of these kind of this chaos here and this color are annual wildflowers that we're growing in between the young shrubs and perennial plants growing in. And then there's this ground cover layer in the front, which is the area that I mentioned before that will flood if there's a large rain event. And then is just our kind of sunken, slightly sheltered meadow area the rest of the year. And this Western meadow sedge, because it's partially shaded, this is still watered no more than twice a month, oftentimes just most of the year, every 3 or 4 weeks as well, and gets a little golden in the summer, but really thrives and does just fine. If it was in full blasting sun, it might need a little bit more water, but in full blasting sun, I guess this is a tangent, but in our demonstration garden, we have some of this in full blasting sun that we water no more than once a week, and it gets about the same amount of water that lavender would need. So you can get that lush, meadowy look without much water. And then all of these different flowers throughout the year, letting the flowers dry into seeds also provides lots of habitat. But having that tiered vegetation provides spaces for the birds that like to be in trees to be in, the birds that like to be in shrubs and on the ground to be in, mixing in into that lower layer, the little bits of rock here and this broken concrete bench that we set up really provides great little places for lizards to hide out and sun themselves as well. So those layers as well. Here you can see in part of my front yard, again, young growing in, but this toyon will be a large shrub that will prune up into a small tree. And then we have ornamental grasses and shrubs. We have lower flowering perennials. Here you can see this is a fall picture. So our California fuchsia is in bloom. Hummingbirds love this, but our red buckwheat has dried out its seeds, and we're leaving those seeds after the flowers fade because lots of birds will either come around and eat the seeds directly off of it, or after those seeds fall to the ground, some other birds will eat those seeds. And then here we have, for a pathway area, it's some mixed wood chip mulch of different species. This is the mulch that we give away for free at the Waterwise Community Center if you are a local resident. And then we edged this area with some branches after the tree work was done in our yard. And in the past, sometimes people will get these from neighbors, but instead of all of the branches getting just ground up and turned into mulch, reusing some of them on site. Not only does it look nice, but these provide kind of habitat for also fungus, some of that fungus, and the fungus that breaks it down is almost always not the fungus that is bad for plants. And as that fungus breaks down, that's then being eaten by little beetles. The beetles in turn are then food for birds and lizards. And so it kind of creates the whole cycle. Some of you are possibly thinking, what about termites leaving branches and wood in the yard? Know your area, know your situation. I use lots of wood in the gardens I am involved with, and I have never had termite issues. I mean, I don't know if it's because it's just not as much of an issue, or because we have so many birds, they're eating most of the termites before they would get into the house. If you know that you have had a history of termites in your yard, and they're the kind that also, or in your house, and they're the kind that also might be going for branches, then maybe you skip that. If you are in an urban wildland interface area and you have to worry about wildfire danger, you are certainly not going to leave branches to slowly decompose anywhere near your house. But I live in the middle of Pomona, where that's not an issue, so I can use them for both the look and the habitat. So part of it is kind of knowing your site in general as well. Here's an example of a great cover plant as well as wildlife habitat plant. This is Rogers Red California grape, which is actually a hybrid between a European wine grape and our native California grape, but grows very much like the native grape with beautiful fall color. And when it is fully grown out for the season, towhees in particular, for whatever reason, really love to hang out in it during the day for cover and then come out and do their thing. And then it gets little grapes that are edible for us, but the birds end up eating most of them, but they're great bird food later in the season. Another part of the structural element is places for birds to perch. Here we have, this was actually a concrete footing for a fence post that we pulled out. And instead of trying to break this up and put it in the trash can, I just flipped it upside down and turned it into a garden object, which we see birds perched on top of, kind of looking around. This is in an area that we grow annual wildflowers in our backyard. And because annual wildflowers turn to birdseed, we do let them dry out. Again, if you live in an urban wildland interface or a high fire danger area, you are not going to do that. As soon as your wildflowers fade, you're going to need to cut them out and get that material out of there. We don't have that issue, so we can leave that for that additional habitat benefit. And so after our wildflowers dry out, it's months and months of birdseed that we've grown in place. And then here, again, we use wood, but you can use anything you want, or even metal poles, or you can easily buy what are called shepherd's hooks for your garden, which are like black steel and have a kind of gentle hook on the upper part. Birds like to perch on those. This is just a branch that my partner dug into the ground and left sticking up. And those are important for the birds that are hunters. And so one of our very common backyard or front yard birds is black phoebe. And black phoebe is a little bird that is an incredible acrobat. And so they eat all sorts of flying insects. And so they like to be up on a perch, and you will see them swoop down and do all sorts of crazy things as they are hunting. Black phoebe is, at least in our area, the only bird other than a hummingbird that can actually hover in place. And so occasionally we will see black phoebes hovering along this rock wall that we have in the back of our backyard, picking spiders out of spider webs. Really cool to see and to support them. So perches, they definitely appreciate, helps them do their hunting. And so woody debris. And this can look as natural or artistic or just basic as you like. Again, be wildfire smart. Not a good idea for everybody. But in our, what kind of looks like a log pile for firewood, we keep, and we've had a few iterations of this. Now we're kind of rearranging logs to make them look nicer. At the beginning, we just had a lot of extra wood from tree trimming and for habitat, not for burning. And it became amazing habitat for birds, lizards. The birds were eating little insects, but had this, for years. And as we are arranging things, never found a single termite. So we know we're doing all right on our site. Use what you can. And, in certain areas, we've gotten around to kind of arranging it more artistically, and it really improves the look. And so mixing different ground cover surfaces really helps. And so with wood chip mulch, I like to use a mixed wood chip mulch just about 2 inches in my native gardens, just to get things established. I don't like to bring in tons and tons of wood chip mulch and really smother the surface year after year after year, but it does help to get things going, to help prevent weed regrowth, and to keep the soil temperatures a little cooler in our hot inland area the first couple of years while plants are growing in, to put down a couple inches of wood chip mulch. But then as things start to grow, they start to kind of self-mulch themselves underneath with leaf litter. When I trim branches or remove wildflowers, or my partner does, sometimes we'll leave just little bits here or there to refresh the mulch layer, oftentimes then refreshing it with things that contain seeds for birds. Different areas will use little bits of gravel or rock. Starts to look more interesting and naturalistic, and provides many other little niches and habitats for different critters that we want to encourage. Diverse coverings on the ground, wood chips, gravel, stones, and for pollinators, very important to always have some area that's not mulched at all. Bare soil is very important for certain ground nesting pollinators. Most of our native pollinators do not sting. The bees that sting are generally European honeybees. Native bees, literally, you would need to be, holding them in your hands, trying to crush them, and they're sure that they're eminently going to die for them to sting you. European honeybees, which are the common bees that are around these days, they have hives where they have concentrated stores of honey and nectar that they need to defend. So they're relatively aggressive. Our native bees that either live in small colonies or are solitary don't have that. And so they're not aggressive. They would rather just go away. They don't want to sting. And so it's important, though, a lot of them will live either in the little holes naturally that occur in logs, or they will live in open soil. So very important to leave some of both, if at all possible. So here's just another example from my yard of some wood. This is a pathway area. So our pathway areas, we do refresh with wood chip mulch as well, and then little bits of gravel and other things as well. And I will say for me, like, this is always an additive process. It's always a little bit of tweaking, things going on here or there. So when we first planted our garden, it was just like wood chip mulch and the plants. And the little bits of stone and wood and little arranging things like this here and there, that's something that my partner has done a lot of, and I've done some of in our backyard over time. And we're still kind of doing that. It's kind of this 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional with time sculpture that we're sort of building out over a long period of time. So here, we added this little bit of rock along this pathway when there was a project. I was finishing digging the dry stream bed, and we dug up, because we have a lot of gravel in our yard, all of this rock. And so instead of leaving it in a pile, we applied it to the landscape. And in our backyard space, our front yard, we kind of did a conventional garden design and then put that design in. In our backyard space, we're kind of just doing this stuff as we end up with material to use and kind of enhancing things. Different sizes and types of woody mulch is what I personally prefer. Lasts a little bit longer and just provides a little bit of different niches compared to something that's very, very kind of small and uniform. And here's an example of a ground dwelling native nesting bee. So just kind of showing, what you need. If this was covered in wood chip mulch or even gravel, this would not be possible. And then it's fine if some of it gets grown over time. So this started as a very gravelly, kind of like mini dry stream bed because of how it fit the site. And then by now, this native strawberry, which was really happy here and gets very little water and requires almost no care on the shady north side of the house, has pretty much grown over it, and that's fine as well. So garden space will evolve. And so together, all of this provides diverse food sources, shelter, niches, and nesting materials for birds and insects, which are also then food for birds and insects and lizards and other insects and all of that. And as an added bonus, having this whole system where you have birds that hunt insects and you have lizards who really like rock areas, especially all of that. It's not that you won't have any pest insects in your yard, but it really helps. And like, for example, in my yard, I know that also really helps my fruit trees and my vegetable garden. So having bush tits come through in big groups of my yard, and I see them going into the citrus trees and gleaning off all of the aphids. There are some aphids in my yard, but I really generally don't have to do much about it because there's enough of a balance where the aphids, they're not damaging my plants and they're providing food for the birds. And so I don't need to deal with it, which is awesome. You may or may not have that situation, but the more of an ecosystem that I've built, the more things kind of stabilize. And then we get to plants. And so there's going to be a whole kind of talk here about selecting the best plants, and we are at 10:30, so I think it's probably a good time for a break. So by the time I'm done talking, it'll actually be 10:33. Why don't we take a break for 5 minutes? And so we'll start back at 10:38. So if you have to use the restroom, grab something to drink, go for it. And at 10:38, we'll start back up with answering a round of questions and then getting into this whole, so how do you select the plants that are going to work best for your yard kind of thing. So we'll be back in just a few.
Okay, we're back. We can get started again. Let's see. So one question that came in. I have a bare area in my garden for a pathway. I can't decide between using gravel or bark mulch. Is there any benefit to one over the other? For a pathway area, not really. They're both definitely appropriate, permeable options. Just depends on what's going to work for you. If it's sloped, gravel can sometimes get slippery, but if it's relatively flat, yeah, just depends on whichever one you will prefer. Both good options that I design for all the time. Okay, so let's talk plants. Plants can be selected to provide seeds, fruits, leaves, or flowers. And so that's going to support a lot of different things. The leaves are going to be very important to support all sorts of different insects, from pollinators, big time to support caterpillars, really important, as well as a variety of other critters. Seeds and fruits for mammals and birds, as well as insects as well. And flowers with nectar and pollen. Nectar, very important for hummingbirds, and nectar and pollen for other insects as well. And so done well, that'll support diverse birds, native bees, butterflies, and other interesting critters. And the best plants for this can easily be selected to be perfectly adapted to our soils and sites, so that they'll require no fertilizers or pesticides and little irrigation water. So we are going to end this workshop for Southern California with my favorite plants for the habitat garden. Now, depending on how things go, we may or may not have time to cover much of that in kind of the live workshop, but you can download the slides, which are all noted on. Personally, for me, my favorite habitat plants, especially for inland areas, but most of them grow well on the coast as well. And it has on the slides what I particularly like about them. So that'll be there for you as a resource, even if we can't get through all of it. So planning your nature sanctuary, selecting your plants. The mantra you want to be thinking of is focus on putting the right plant in the right place. This is for anything that has to do with gardening or horticulture. Whenever people come to me and say, I'm just not good at growing plants, I always ask them, before you buy a plant and put it into the ground, do you do just a little bit of research, which is so easy these days with all the resources on the internet, to make sure you understand for this plant in our area, how much sun does it want? How much water does it need? So you can make sure to group it with other plants that need the same amount of water, same frequency, same amount, roughly. How large it is going to get at its full mature size. And if you happen to have clay soil that doesn't drain well, whether or not the plant needs good drainage for its soil. Every single time I ask someone that question who says they're bad at growing plants, they have always said, no, they do not do that. People who are good at growing plants do that when they're growing a new plant. It's the simplest thing. And I can share with you some resources of where to do some of that for Southern California plants. Put that right plant in the right place. In our California Native Garden Design class, we're going to go deep into that. So please join us for that, or you can also check out our online workshop recordings. Another online workshop recording that is very useful in thinking about all of this in that right plant, right place, and also kind of buying good, healthy plant material when you're at the nursery, how to assess it, is we have I think it's called like Choosing, Purchasing, and Planting California Native and Waterwise Plants workshop that I teach once a year, but there's a recording on our YouTube page. Between this one, the California Native Garden Design class, and that one will have you very well set up for figuring that all out. And then when it comes time to actually installing the garden, we have an installation and establishment for Native and Waterwise Gardens class as well. That goes through installation tips, proper planting, all that sort of stuff. If you're starting with a small area, which if you are kind of very new to doing this, it's not bad at all to start small and then build on your successes. For habitat gardening, if all you have to work with is shade, plenty of plants. But if you are starting with a small area and you have a sunny area, that'll give you the most choices and probably be the most effective, especially when it comes to pollinators, and then having a lot of flowers throughout the year, seed production. That's generally a little bit easier to work with in a sunny area. For maximum impact, aim to have a diversity of species in bloom and in fruit for as much of the year as possible. And in Southern California, as well as most of California, we can have stuff blooming year round, different things coming in and out because of the different life cycles of our native plants, but also keep it maintainable. Know your limits. Some people I work with really want to go whole hog on habitat gardening. They want to have 30, 50 species of plants in their yard, look it all up, learn them all of that. But a lot of people that I work with as well, they don't want to become, quote, gardeners. They just want to be people with more interesting landscapes than they currently have. They like the idea of having a landscape that's beneficial to the earth and to wildlife, but they don't want to learn 50 different plants and how to care for them as well. So it is perfectly possible to have an entire front yard that's 12 plants or even fewer that are still great habitat plants. Maybe you won't have blooms year round, but you can select really good plants that are useful to birds, butterflies, and pollinators and still be making a big difference. You don't need to do 100 different species if you don't want to. Most small or medium-sized yards that I design, even if they're habitat-focused gardens, are going to have 12 to 15 well-chosen species, maybe up to 20, and it can be less. So don't feel like you need to do that. It's also a little bit easier for a first-time garden designer for a front yard, if you want it to have like a very cohesive look, to not have quite as many different species. That gets much trickier aesthetically. And if the wildness doesn't appeal to you, it doesn't need to look that wild. In fact, large masses of well-selected plants can be even better for butterflies, small native bees, and some songbirds, because when that plant is in bloom, they can go from plant to plant to plant. So that's not to say a monoculture of just one kind of plant, but to have kind of simpler blocks of plants like this can work. This is a 85% native front yard in, I think this was in Northridge. It was somewhere in the West San Fernando Valley. That was on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And it is kind of very clipped and kind of conventional look and maintenance, but with plants that are good habitat plants. And so with all of that clipping to get that more conventional look, you do lose some of the habitat value, but certainly it's night and day more useful to wildlife than the conventional landscape that it probably replaced. So if that's the look that's going to work for you, you can do it and select your plants carefully to still have great plants that support wildlife. So for more design tips, talking about combining plants for aesthetics and that sort of stuff, it's more than we can get into in this class, but definitely check out that California Native Garden Design Workshop online, or also we're going to be teaching it, I believe next month. I'm going to be teaching that online. Flowers year round, if you can do that. So here are just a few examples. This is at the Nature Gardens at the LA County Natural History Museum. I just like this picture because it's 3 fall blooming plants. So not as much as blooming in the fall, but for a shrub, coyote brush is one of our top fall blooming native plants and grows very quickly, very reliable plant. And then both of these kind of spread a lot in the garden. I actually grow both of these because they can also take a little bit more water as ground cover underneath the fruit tree section in our garden at home. California goldenrod and California aster are excellent for habitat fall blooming plants, but they can be pretty aggressive spreaders. So good for kind of a corner of the yard. California fuchsia is another one of the top ones for gardens. So notes on garden care, really important. Don't deadhead faded flowers too quickly. That's conventional gardening kind of stuff. This is not a rose garden where the more you deadhead, the longer you're going to get your roses. Certain native plants will respond to deadheading and bloom longer, but if you keep deadheading them, you'll never develop the seeds. So very little deadheading in my garden. let those seeds develop. And then when you do cut plants back, as long as you're not in a fire prone area, consider leaving as much of the trimmings in the garden as you can on the ground as new mulch. So sometimes this can be larger branches, but oftentimes I'll do a little bit of just cutting things down with my hand pruners to smaller bits on the ground as mulch. And then recently, I'm kind of still evaluating it because I haven't had the machine for that long, but I recently invested in a small electric, so it doesn't make a lot of pollution. And the way that it is set up is very safe grinder for kind of larger branches. Does branches up to about 1 inch, so nothing super large, but just kind of like if I cut back a sage and have a big pile of branches or other kind of small trimmings from trees, when I do some light trimming to skirt up my oak tree, I grind up all of that using this electric grinder, and it takes a while. I'll put my headphones in and like listen to an audiobook, but it makes a really nice diverse mulch out of all native plant materials that have come from my garden instead of needing to send it off in the green bin. The one I use, I don't know if it's the best one out there. I just did some research online. It's made by a company called Sunjo, and it costs less than $200. And so far it's working really well for me. I don't always do it with 100% of my material because it does take a while, but it really, has been going pretty well so far. I don't feel like you need to be too neat. So this area looks really sloppy, partially because you can't see any of the design intent yet because the tree hasn't grown in. But these are annual Clarkias, annual wildflowers that have just been left to dry out. But the reason why I leave them there is because goldfinches love Clarkia. So this is the same area, just with better lighting and a more set up photograph. And so you can see here that Western redbud, young tree. So this is the Western redbud. And so these dry out, but then for literally months, goldfinches spend every morning in the garden picking through and eating out every one of these tiny little Clarkia seeds, and they drop some of them. And then we have other birds, mostly towhees and mourning doves, that come in and eat all the drop seeds. So these are bird feeders, and they're hilarious to watch. They'll climb to the very end, and the stalks will bend over with their weight, and they'll sway back and forth in the wind, and they'll spend all of this time picking them apart. And so this is kind of the extreme version of that. This is in our wildflower meadow, which eventually gets cut back at the end of the season, but is our bird feeder. And then when we turn that into mulch, we're leaving the seed stems and etc. around when cutting back the plants. Birds will eat the seed, and beneficial insects, including native bees, also nest in some of the larger stems. So choosing and learning about plants, top choices for California. Our agency has created a website called the Inland Valley Garden Planner, which I will show you in just a second, do a quick little demo because we've added some new features to it. There we have profiles of our top 350 plants for like the average home gardener in our area. About a third of those, so over 100 of those are native. So if you're really getting into habitat gardening, that won't be everything that you're growing, but if you're someone who's just getting started, it has all of our top choices. So I have lots of plants at home that are not in that because we're always trying all sorts of weird and cool, rare stuff. But if you just want to go to a couple of native plant nurseries, learn about stuff that's likely to be there and the stuff that we think are easiest and kind of the best bang for your buck in terms of what new people and average gardeners will try, Inland Valley Garden Planner is a great resource. When you want to really delve deeper, really learn about stuff that maybe is like local to your specific area, literally be able to see what would have been native to my zip code, or also be able to learn more about the kind of wider variety of stuff that you might get from botanical gardens, more specialty nurseries, as well as another good resource. I'll look up plants on Calscape as well, because sometimes they have different information than we have accumulated on our Inland Valley Garden Planner. Calscape is the resource from the California Native Plant Society, quite an excellent resource. And then another one that I really like, especially when you are getting into butterflies and wanting to know what the larval host plant, so the plant that the butterfly larvae need to eat because they're restricted to certain plants that they've evolved with, and then good plants for the adult butterflies. There is a YouTube channel called Landscape Integrity Films and Education that has great material on native habitat gardens. The acronym is LIFE, but if you just type in LIFE in YouTube, you will not find it. Landscape Integrity Films and Education. And they have a whole series for those of you in our local area that was shot at an incredible native home garden in Riverside that just has lots and lots of relevant information. So let's see, doing all right on time. I'll do a very quick demo for Inland Valley Garden Planner. Let's open this up. inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. Let's close some of these windows. Oh, we're bogging down. Okay, so this is our Inland Valley Garden Planner website. A couple of things you can do with this. So this was developed for inland Southern California, but people use it all over the place. Like I mentioned earlier, just check it with local information if you're farther out. But for example, for our purposes, if you want to say, well, I'm looking for a shrub, I want it to be California native, I want it to be low water, it's going to be in a full sun area, and I want it to be a good butterfly plant. So from all of the different things you can grow in Southern California, here are our top 17 shrubs that meet all those criteria. And from that, then you can look at the different right plant, right place factors, height, width, exposure, and then all of these have their own profiles where you can see pictures in different situations, plant properties, so that soil, so this one can take clay soil. Also, if you do happen to have clay soil, there is one of those criteria you can just check off and let it, tell it you have clay soil. Wildlife value, all sorts of different stuff. Water needs, so you learn how to group it with other plants to understand how this works and what this means for your irrigation system. We have additional information. And then also you need to know how to maintain it over time. Most of these plants are very easy to maintain. Most of them in an average residential yard just get cut back some, cleaned up once a year. But it's very important to know what time of year to do that, because if you do it in the wrong time of year, you might cut off everything that's about to turn into your blooms for the season. So we have all that information for you. If you want to create a login, you can then create a profile where you can save different lists as well and keep that all organized for your ideas for your projects. For some people who really want to start simple, we also have these different garden design templates that we have created. So a couple of our popular ones are the butterfly and songbird garden and the pollinator garden. Some of the same plants exist in each of them. Realistically, you can mix and match those plants to create a dynamic habitat garden. A lot of the ones that are good for one are good for the other, but we got a lot of feedback from people that it's kind of intimidating of how to start. So they just wanted some kind of concepts to go with and to be able to kind of learn the basics. And so, for example, if you can mix and match a lot of these, as long as you check that right plant, right place stuff, but just to get a start, for example, for the butterfly and songbird garden, then we have example plans of extra large, large, medium, and small gardens using a simplified plant template. So for most of these, we have like our top 13 or 15 different plants. Some of them are good for shade, some of them are good for sun, trees, shrubs, perennials. This one has an ornamental grass, which is actually more than ornamental. It's an important habitat plant for especially small finches. And so how to take that simple, kind of easy to grow, relatively easy to find plant palette, and then kind of set those up working with each other. So we have labeled and unlabeled versions where the plants pop up and then you can get a link directly to the plant profile, and kind of multiple views of what it might look like. If you want something less dense, that's fine as well. But you can still kind of take some of these ideas and plant combinations. And then if you like any of that, there's a scaled. So this is the exact plan of what that would kind of generally look like in that rendering. And you can literally download PDF packages of these and print these out. And if you print it out on 11 by 17 paper, it actually scales to where 1/8 of an inch is equivalent to 1 foot in the real world. So you can see the plant combinations, And if there's anything you like, you can kind of emulate them in your own landscape. And so that's a really large garden. But if you have a small area, you can still kind of work with the theme and do that and everything in between. And then these also have descriptions, watering schedules, and all of that. If you download the PDF packet, there's also information in terms of like planting techniques, working with wildflowers, how to dig a functional dry stream bed, all sorts of additional information. We're currently working on a whole series of videos that walk you through step-by-step how to take your own site measurements and use these as a starting point and do your own custom design. So that should hopefully be up in the next few months. We kind of keep getting busy and delaying it, but it is coming along. So sign up for the newsletter if you're interested, and you'll definitely be notified. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Calscape.org is the other one that I mentioned. This is the project from the California Native Plant Society. And there's a couple of different things you can do. It is very interesting to enter an address or a zip code and see the plants that were thought to be once native to that location. So for example, 91763, this is where the Waterwise Community Center is. And here you can get profiles for the 662 plants that might have once grown in that area. So obviously that is a lot of plants. And a lot of them you won't be able to find in the nursery. So that's pretty interesting, but a couple of things. One is local native plants are great to include. I don't always recommend exclusively working with local native plants. For example, where we live in our area, we also have some urban heat island effect. It's been very dry lately. And if we are trying to maximize habitat, bringing in native plants from other areas can help extend the flowering season. So for example, both at the Waterwise Community Center and as well as in my yard in Pomona, I also work with a lot of native desert plants that do come from farther east, because after our local native plants have stopped kind of blooming as much in the early summer, throughout the summer during our punishing heat waves, the native desert plants keep blooming and keep blooming. So it adds some. So there are other ways that you can go about doing it. But just for example here, for the average kind of gardener getting started, of those 662 plants, they have 83 of them that are very easy to grow. So you might look at that as some of your list. And again, some of these will be easy to find in the nurseries. Some of these will be less, but these are all good things to take a look at. And then they have, some of them are from riparian areas and turn into trees that could be almost 100 feet tall. But they have great profiles as well, where you can learn about great information, including what specific butterflies and moths this plant is likely to be a food source for the caterpillars of. So they have some really great habitat information. And so that is Calscape. And so with that, let's get back to the main slideshow. And we'll look at some design inspiration. Some of my favorite simple plant combinations as good places to get started. And so this is one of our design examples from the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And so some of my top favorite simple plant combinations. This is a great one for along walkways, edges, driveways, in front yards, some smaller perennial plantings. Margarita bop penstemon is a very small native perennial, comes back year after year, 6 inches to a foot high to maybe 3 feet wide. Great looking iridescent flowers that are like pink to bluish, come back year after year, are magnets for hummingbirds and bees, pretty long bloom season, and then hosts for the caterpillars of butterflies and moths, including common buckeye and checker spots. And most of these native plants that are caterpillar hosts, you will likely never see the caterpillars on them, but then you'll see the butterflies. It's not like you're normally going to get such an infestation of damage that they're going to be eating back the whole plant. And if you see a few leaves being munched or you see the caterpillar, that's a good thing. The birds are also going to eat a lot of the caterpillars. Caterpillars are absolutely necessary for the vast majority of baby birds. Certain species that eat mostly seeds when they're older, the young still often need the dense protein concentration from insects, and caterpillars are the best way to get that protein concentration and often necessary. So caterpillars in your garden are necessary both for butterflies as well as to support healthy baby bird populations. Super critical. Red buckwheat is another one of my favorite easy, smaller habitat plants. This is a cousin of our local native California buckwheat, but from the Channel Islands. 6 inches to maybe a foot tall, again, often about 2 feet wide, long flowering season that usually begins in late spring or early summer and will bloom almost through fall often. In my parking lot at work right now, because it gets extra reflected heat, it's already in bloom. Flowers used by many pollinators and butterflies. Birds will eat the seed, and lots of butterfly species use it as a host plant. And all of these plants work in full sun or even in our inland heat, some part shade. For adult butterflies, for the nectar source, Delamina verbena is probably the #1 plant that I see butterflies on all throughout the year. It's also used by bees, has a really long flowering season with a peak in spring. If it's in full sun in summer, it can go semi-dormant, meaning even if there's enough water, they'll still kind of look dried out, but that can be normal, and they will usually recover quite well as soon as it cools off in the fall and after our first rains. And then the last one is hummingbird sage, which is one of my favorite native plants. Flowers are loved by hummingbirds, used by bees. Looks incredible in spring, early summer, often flowers again in the fall. If it is in full blasting sun inland, it's to look good, it's going to want a little bit of supplemental water. So the one in my front yard, in between my once a month front yard waterings, about halfway in between, I'll probably give it a little bit of a drink with a hose just to keep it looking better, or it can kind of go somewhat dormant and come back in the fall. Or you can put it in somewhere where it gets afternoon shade and it won't need that as much. And then kind of less inland, a little bit more coastal, it's a little bit more tolerant. But it is absolutely one of my favorite plants, so really worth that seasonal up and down. Another kind of area that I get a lot of questions about is what to do on the north side of a house or on the north side of a garage, where it's going to be shady a lot of the year because the sun is kind of in the little bit of the south of the sky. And then in midsummer, though, the sun is very high and it's full blasting sun. And so you really need plants that can take both the shady conditions and the sunny conditions. And here are some of my favorite plants for that. Is up against the house, I will often use where I want the shrub to be lower, but I still want some presence there, like a little bit of a foundation planting. I'll often use Eve Case California coffeeberry. California coffeeberry is a very diverse shrub that grows in many, many situations up and down the state. And the normal species is pretty big, 8, maybe even 10 feet tall and wide. But there's a dwarf one called Eve Case that's usually 4-ish, maybe 4.5 feet tall and 5 to maybe 6 feet wide, but it easily takes pruning to keep it more contained than that, and can take sun or shade. So it's really, really great in north-facing situations and can take full sun or shade year-round as well. Many birds eat the fruit and the seeds, especially the medium-sized birds like jays and mockingbirds. Little birds will eat them as well. Hosts butterflies, including gray hairstreak and pale tiger swallowtail, and we'll look at some butterflies later. And dense structure provides cover for birds. And then kind of more like in front of the wall of a house where you're not worried about blocking a window, manzanitas can be very good as well. So sunset manzanita is one of my favorites. Very beautiful, very easy to grow. Some of the manzanitas are kind of tough to grow and they're very sensitive to getting a little too much water in the summer at the wrong time. They can be very disease prone if in garden situations. But sunset manzanita and another one called Howard McMinn are probably two of the easiest to grow in inland Southern California. And they bloom in winter through early spring, and hummingbirds and butterflies love the nectar. So they go into bloom when not a lot of other stuff is in bloom. And then they get fruit that's liked by birds afterwards. They're small, kind of dryish berries, and an extremely beautiful plant. Hummingbird sage also works well in that situation. Not shown above, but this is right up against the north side of my house. You can see as a ground cover, California strawberry, also called woodland strawberry. There's a couple of different native strawberries. Woodland strawberry does very well. And when it's in the shade, requires very little water for how lush of a plant. It gets blooms that beneficial insects like, and it does get small, tiny strawberries, which are sometimes sweet. And I'll eat a couple if I'm out doing garden maintenance, but the birds are going to eat most of them. And then just kind of grows around and fills in around shrubs, or here, example, an ornamental or a native grass, California fescue, which can be hard to find, but also does well in that north-facing situation. And then one of my go-to plants for many situations, but especially in the north-facing part of the yard, is yarrow. Killia millefolium is the scientific name. There's a few different yarrows. So sometimes this one's called common yarrow, but it's always good when you go to the nursery to write down the scientific name, even if you'll never remember it, because that's how you'll match it to the plant and make sure you're really, really getting the right plant. Yarrow does so many great things. It's used by many pollinators and beneficial insects when it's in bloom. It is absolutely adored by ladybugs, as well as hoverflies, which are beneficial insects that eat a lot of pest insects as well. And ladybugs, there's something about fuzzy foliaged plants that ladybugs just love. So even when it's not in bloom, I see ladybugs just hanging out on the leaves. Birds will eat the seeds, and it's used as a host plant for multiple moth species, which again, we might not see in the garden, but moths have caterpillars as well. Really important bird food. And they're native species, which are important to support. It spreads by roots, so it kind of forms a mat. So for example, in this situation, it would eventually fill in, kind of like it's not a grass, but kind of like how certain grasses will spread and fill in. It can be a little bit aggressive, but in my front yard, for example, about once a year, I just spend some time pulling it out where it's grown beyond where I want it to grow. So not a ton of maintenance, but it fills in nicely, covers the soil, and when it blooms, it's incredible. Looks nice even when it's not in bloom. And it really, because it can always take extra moisture, I almost always will use it at the base of a bird bath, so that when I tilt the bird bath out into the yarrow, it just really thrives in that situation. Really great combination. And then just a couple more examples to show, and then we will move on. I really, really like the idea of turning the edges of your property. Oftentimes people will have just a fence or maybe a cinder block wall that doesn't look that great. And the edges of a property are a really, really easy way to get started with habitat gardening, because we can fill that space with a density of plant material that provides great cover for birds, as well as a whole variety of other beneficial wildlife. They become great nesting sites. And so a habitat hedge is just a relatively densely planted row of plants, and we'll often choose multiple different species that will work well for the area. So this is an example of a layout for a habitat hedge where the individual plants would grow wider, but planting 5 to 6 feet apart, 3 each of hollyleaf cherry, coyote brush, and California coffeeberry, all of which are great habitat for insects and birds as well. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of the benefits for all of them. You kind of get the idea that a lot of these selected plants do a lot of different things. I want to make sure we have time to cover other stuff. But again, you can download, if you look at the top of the chat, you can download the PDF presentation and then read up all about it. And so here, I think I'm actually going to kind of skip through it in the interest of time to make sure we cover other things. But we have example for an easy to maintain meadow of deer grass with some showy penstemon and other accents. And then remember as well that a lot of these have an example matched on that Inland Valley Garden Planner in the design styles. So you can get all of that on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. And you can do all of this in containers as well. So if you only have a balcony, if you are renting, or sometimes just around a patio space, even if you do have a whole yard, you can grow habitat plants in containers. It will take a bit more care and more frequent watering because there's less root zone and will dry out faster, but you can grow many of our favorite habitat plants in containers. Some will take full sun, but many, even if they're full sun plants in the ground, if you're growing in inland hot Southern California, will appreciate some afternoon shade, especially during the hot time of year. They're going to need water more often. And really, it's best to check because that's going to change throughout the year. Basically, when the top 1 to 2 inches of soil are dry after the plant has grown in. If it's a quite large size pot, that can be about once per week in the warm weather, possibly more. That's why it's best to check. And you need well-draining soil for most native plants. So the easiest way to do that is I pretty much just use cactus mix from the nursery. Works out very well for native plants as well. So favorite container habitat plants, we've already talked about some of these. Eve case coffeeberry, I have one of those in a pot at my house, even though I have plenty in the ground, which looks nice and the birds like it. Monkey flowers, penstemons, verbena. So we talked about some of these. Red buckwheat, in the shade, heuchera or coral bells, yarrow, and seaside daisy in part shade. There's many, many more. There's lots of different native plant lists for containers online. And yeah, you can have fun and experiment with that as well. So finding them, buying them, planting them, and then what? So again, check out our YouTube channel, the Choosing, Purchasing, Planting Waterwise and Native Plants Online, Installation Establishment of California Native and Waterwise Gardens, the maintenance information at Inland Valley Garden Planner. And then for the maintenance, we tell you what to do. However, not everybody knows what it means by, cutting back the plant halfway or something like that. So there's also another online workshop that's pruning and maintenance for home gardens and landscapes, which will give you all of the basics so that when you read the information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, you have more context and you've seen some step-by-step examples of what that actually looks like when it's done to plants. And then you also, if you are looking for these native plants, in our Western San Bernardino County or in Eastern Los Angeles, or even into more Los Angeles area, you're not going to be able to find these at just any nursery, but there are plenty of nurseries these days that have great selections of native plants. And so if you go to that cbwcd.org/presentations webpage that I mentioned, and that's typed at the top of the chat, there's also a file you can download. That's our local landscape suppliers list. And that has local landscape suppliers for everything from where you would buy mulch or rocks to the nurseries in our general area and what sorts of plants that they do a good job stocking. So definitely check that out as well. And so with that, I'll check out some questions and then we're going to kind of go into the field guide section of it where I'll mention some of the common birds, butterflies, and pollinators you're likely to see and some information about them so you can start to kind of know them. And then we'll talk about some plants at the end and probably just kind of end up showing you the other references that you have. So let's answer some questions. Is there a drip system that can be installed on overground sprinkler heads that you can recommend? I'm not sure, Susanna, what you mean by that question. However, I will say that there is no overall perfect irrigation system. But if you are talking about how to adapt a typical lawn sprinkler system over to a drip system, yeah, there are ways to do that. There are great ways to do that, and there are not great ways to do that. And then also for native plants, you don't always need to go over to a drip system. Sometimes you can adapt and increase the efficiency of an overhead spray irrigation system and do quite well. And it just depends on your design and other things. But I have a whole workshop that we teach about that. So, and also some supplemental videos kind of showing step-by-step stuff. So if you go to our YouTube channel, cbwcd.org/YouTube, we have both a playlist and a workshop called Retrofitting Turf Irrigation Systems for Waterwise and Native Plants. And that will give you the full in-depth answer of what exactly I would recommend thinking about. From Leslie, will this be recorded for future reference? Yes, this is being recorded. And after some editing, and it'll probably be about a week and a half because I'm going to be out of town. This will be posted, but there is already a previous version of this workshop posted that goes over the vast majority of the same information on our YouTube channel. From Dan, what if undesirable pests enter the garden? How do you deal with them? Well, one of the really cool things about doing habitat gardening is that there is such a balance in the ecosystem, especially with all of the birds and predators of pest insects, that I can't say it never happens, but it really almost never happens. I have never had to do any real pest control in native plantings because all of this life shows up and everything stays kind of balanced. So like, yes, there's aphids. Occasionally there's a little bit of scale, but there are so many what I consider kind of good guys also eating it that it doesn't cause harm to the plants. It just provides a little bit of food. And that food source that's there in small amounts keeps the predators kind of living on site. And so there really is a lot of a balance. If anything does have an outbreak, my kind of go-to is really, I don't use insecticides because that can have different accumulations and negative effects for our good guys. So for example, like with aphids and scale, a hose with a high pressure attachment and just kind of blasting them off a couple of times over the course of a couple of weeks, and then letting the good guys kind of catch up to speed is often all that needs to be done. And the one real exception is Argentinian ants. Those are, at this point, most of Southern California, our most common small ant species. And they, unlike the ants that evolved here, are super, super aggressive ranchers of scale and aphids. On most plants, it's not an issue. On most of the common plants, I recommend for the average home gardener, it's not an issue. But on certain plants, including Ceanothus and Manzanita, it can be an issue. They particularly like some of those. And blasting things off is kind of my go-to. But sometimes I do need to do the ant control because the ants themselves are the ones that are aggressively spreading the insects that suck on the juices of the plants that can cause problems over time in extreme concentration. And then the ants themselves can make extremely large colonies at the bases of the plants and kind of cause some problems for the root systems. And so for that, I don't spray, but there are a number of ant baits, which the actual poison to the ants is basically borax, like the old laundry additive. It's non-toxic. It doesn't accumulate or cause problems to other birds or insects. And so taro is the most common one that you can get at any hardware store. And basically it's just borax and sweetener. It's not certified organic because it hasn't gone through the process and like the sweetener and all, it's not organic, but essentially it's non-toxic to just about everything except the ants. It's pet safe and all that sort of stuff. And if you really want to get into it, like the taro is a kind of strong concentration, and really more effective long-term control is sometimes found with lower concentrations. And there's DIY kind of ways of mixing up borax and sweetener, more than we can get into. But looking at borax-based ant baits, if you notice lots of ants as part of it, is something to kind of have in mind. I think that's about as far as that we can get into, but I'm glad we mentioned it. From David, would compost count as keeping the soil bare for ground-based insects versus covering the ground with wood chip mulch? Good question. No, they want real mineral soil. So compost, would not count. Okay, and question from Ann P. And I want to make sure that we talk about it because milkweeds and butterflies are common. And then we'll hopefully have the time to get into talking about our butterflies. But Anne has a butterfly garden that she thinks has parasites. On the milkweed, monarchs are hatching with deformities and health issues, and they are prone. It can happen. How can I get rid of that on my plants to have a healthy cycle for the monarchs? Okay, a couple of things related to milkweeds that are very important. First one, unrelated but important to mention. If you are growing milkweeds, native or otherwise, and I encourage you to grow native milkweeds, and we'll talk about why in relation to the larger issue. You will always have little yellow aphids on your milkweeds. That is fine. They will not affect the health of the milkweed, even if there's a lot of them. They just are always growing together. If you spray them off, if you use pesticides, which you really don't want to on your milkweeds, they will come back. Just accept it. They're like ornaments and they're bird food. So the yellow aphids are just part of growing milkweeds. Don't worry about it. If it seems, and I've never seen this happen, but if it seems like there's so many of them that the health of the plant is declining, you can spray some off with water or just run your fingers over them and kind of smush them off. Wear a glove if you want to, and just kind of reset some balance. They'll come back, but just generally don't worry about it. But there are pathogens that will accumulate on milkweeds and can cause issues with monarch development. And I believe that's the case with what you're talking about. I am not an expert in this, so I might be wrong with your specific parasite, but this is the main one people are worried about. And what can happen is this bacteria, I believe it's a bacteria, not a fungus. Again, I could be wrong about that. I just want to be upfront about that. This is something I'm still learning about. But that pathogen can accumulate on the foliage of milkweeds. And then when larvae of monarchs eat the flowers or form their pupa, it can cause issues. One of the things that we can do and really, really should be doing if we are growing milkweeds is making sure that we cut them to the ground every year and do not leave that biomass, those stems and leaves in our gardens. Those we want to put in the green waste and get out of our gardens because of the concentration and the pathogens. Historically, the native milkweeds, and like down around us, narrowleaf milkweed would be the most common one. They are supposed to be deciduous, meaning they're supposed to totally die to the ground in the winter. And so that biomass will die back, and that would help control the pathogens. Because our winters have been warmer lately, that does not always happen. And because the pathogens are also present, essentially what we are doing is when it gets to the winter, and you can kind of see, like at the end of the season, the milkweeds look really kind of like they're done for the season. In the winter, we want to cut them all the way to the ground and remove all of that. So that basically is like inducing that dormancy and getting rid of that biomass instead of allowing it to accumulate those pathogens year after year. That is also one of the reasons why the native milkweeds are more recommended than the tropical milkweeds. The tropical milkweeds, which are the common ones that are sold at the hardware store and big box nurseries, as well as other nurseries as well, they're beautiful, but they tend to not go dormant and people don't know to cut them back. And so they can really get a lot of that pathogen accumulated on it. So yeah, that's just kind of part of the necessity of maintaining them for the health of your butterfly population. So hopefully that helps. And that being said, also, even when you're doing that, there's going to be a lot of monarch butterfly caterpillars. And like we do that in my yard, and there's a ton of caterpillars, and some of them still don't make it out of the pupa. Occasionally, some of them are deformed, but it's a numbers game, and you're never going to have 100% survival of them, even if you are doing everything correct. So also know that as well, but just do the best you can, and it's going to be better for the butterflies overall than if you aren't doing it. And so with that, let's make sure that we get to our field guide. So we're going to talk about our most common backyard birds for Southern California. A couple of other notes about birds that I want to mention. Whether or not we are doing habitat gardening, but especially if we are doing habitat gardening, we need to be aware of nesting season and the responsibilities that come with that. When we invite birds into our gardens, we want them to be nesting. But we don't want to then go and do a bunch of pruning, especially of major branches of our trees, while there might be active nests in those trees or large shrubs. So in Southern California,
nesting season is considered to be January 1st through September 30th. So that's a large part of the year. January 1st, so New Year's, through September 30th. So basically, all of our major tree work ideally would be done in October, November, and December. So that still gives us 3 months. So our trees that are better to prune in the dry season, like oaks, you don't generally prune oaks in the middle of winter because there can be, in the moist season, fungal diseases. You want to prune those right at the beginning of October. And then our kind of deciduous trees that are more pruned in the winter, you want to prune those generally in like December. And that's especially true for larger trees. So for smaller trees, like medium-sized fruit trees, especially when they lose their leaves and you would classically prune them in the winter, you know, if I have a 10-foot tall persimmon tree, I'm just going to look very carefully at all of those branches before I prune it and make sure that there's no nest still in there. And chances are that by the time it loses its leaves, there's not going to be an active nest that early in the season. You know, if I'm pruning my persimmon in February, it has no leaves on it, it probably won't have an early nest built in it because there's no cover. But you always want to make sure. Your large shrubs, like there's occasional large native shrubs like ceanothus. Ceanothus is pruned in the spring, right after it's done flowering. It's not so huge. Look very carefully in your ceanothus and just make sure there's no active nests in there. But you always want to be aware of nesting season. And then the other thing that I'll just mention, because it's been happening lately, as long as we're specifically talking about birds, is masks, like the surgical style masks, the disposable masks that people are wearing because of COVID. Birds have been getting tangled in those. I just read something about it was an American kestrel, so a raptor locally that got its wings tangled up to it and got injured. It's in rehab right now, and they're hoping it'll be able to go back into the wild, but people don't know because they can get tangled up in those masks. So definitely near your garden, make sure that they are not left around. If you see them kind of in your neighborhood, although we don't always want to pick up other people's used masks with a glove or something like that, don't leave them out. They're starting to cause problems for our local birds when they are just kind of left on the street. Okay, so now on to more exciting things than that, which are what birds are likely going to show up. So very common one, northern mockingbird, medium-sized songbird, eats lots of insects and berries, and easy to ID because it has these large white patches on its wings and a pretty long tail, have great calls where they imitate all sorts of other things. They're very territorial. The males are pretty funny. They kind of fight for territory. I don't see them injuring each other, but lots of chasing around. And their courting is pretty cool to watch too. American goldfinch is a really common one. Super, super bright yellow. These are mostly seed eaters, small insects, wildflower seeds, grass seeds, usually in pretty large flocks, except for when they're breeding. Birdbath regulars, one of the smaller birds that we get, not the tiniest, but small finches. Lesser goldfinch looks very similar, kind of a more dusty yellow, mostly seeds, kind of all the same kind of stuff. A little bit larger than goldfinch, and I had one of these, showed you in my bird bath this morning, common at bird baths, house finches, mostly seeds and small insects, and also bird bath regulars. Occasionally, we'll get hooded orioles. This is one of the migrants that comes through my yard in the warm season and then flies south. They really like insects and fruit as well. Berries, nectar. Sometimes they'll be trying to get at hummingbird feeders. Their beaks are a little too big, so oftentimes they're not successful. So they will eat like the coffee berries and cherries, native cherries in my garden. But also, if you want to support them a little bit extra, if you have citrus trees, like we have orange trees, and we'll leave a couple of orange slices out for them, and they will actually eat all of the little wedges out of the orange slice as well. So that's kind of cool. Medium size, really beautiful birds.
White-crowned sparrow. This is the one that I mentioned. When the white-crowned sparrows show up in my yard, having come down from the mountain, that's when I know it's fall. This year, they literally showed up on the first day of fall. They eat lots of seeds, mostly off the ground in the winter, the stuff that's fallen. Lots of time in the bird bath, all sorts of bird bath shenanigans. And then they'll head back up to the mountains after that. Very charismatic. California towhee is a medium size. They're technically a large sparrow, but they're quite large for a sparrow, medium-sized bird. They're also seed eaters, mostly. They'll eat insects as well on the ground. Oftentimes you'll see them in pairs that they form long-term. And the males will aggressively defend their territory, but mostly from other towhees. So they're very compatible. They'll be right around with other birds poking around on the ground, but usually we'll have like a towhee couple, and that will be the couple, at least for the season, in our yard. And they'll also be in our bird baths. Hummingbirds are very hard to tell apart because they move so quickly. So I'll show you pictures, but I will be quite honest. When they're in my yard, I am usually not sure which one it is. But our two most common hummingbirds are Anna's hummingbird, which are common year-round, and Allen's hummingbird. Nectar and small insects, they get their energy, their carbohydrates from nectar or hummingbird feeders if you put them out, but they get a lot of their other nutrients from small insects. So again, having this whole ecosystem nearby. They are super territorial. Some people will have multiple hummingbirds that can happily coexist. In my yard, there are always multiple hummingbirds around, but they're often chasing each other around. And the males, especially right now, are doing really crazy mating and territorial displays where they'll fly way up into the air, like until you can't even see them, and come swooping down, making really, really crazy noises with their wings. Really cool to have around. And then you might happen to see hummingbird nest if you are lucky. One of the cool things about hummingbird nests is if you see a hummingbird gathering spider webs. We leave a decent amount of spider webs up in our garden. Yes, we are kind of lazy about things like that, but you can see here in this nest, the nest is actually stuck together with spider webs, which makes the nest kind of elastic. And so if you see the nest when the eggs are in there, it's really, really small, right around the eggs. And then as the young birds grow, it expands because it's the elastic spider webs that are holding it together. They will also harvest the little fuzz off of native sycamore leaves and use that to line the inside of their nests. So really cool process. Nests are really fascinating. This is my favorite hummingbird feeder design. This is one of the hummingbird feeders that we have in our yard. For a long time, I was very suspect. I figured just sugar water in the hummingbird feeder couldn't have possibly like all the nutrients of like natural nectar that hummingbirds probably would benefit from. And I was able to ask an ornithologist at the LA Natural History Museum about it. And he said actually that the nectar in flowers is pretty much just sugar water, and that they get all their other nutrients out of the insects that they eat. And so feeders are just fine. The really important thing, though, is only have feeders out if you are going to keep it clean on a very regular basis, because sugar water will turn moldy and be bad for the birds very quickly, especially in the warm weather. And so one of the reasons why I like this hummingbird feeder design, easy to buy online, I think these are like $15 last time I checked, is that some of the longer, narrower hummingbird feeders are very hard to clean very well. And this works very well for the hummingbirds to land and drink, but is also really easy to take apart and clean. And so you need to know if you're the kind of person to do this. In the summer, it's pretty much every day. I am not the kind of person who would keep the hummingbird feeder clean enough, often enough, remake hummingbird water, which is just sugar and water, heat it up past boiling. You can find the instructions online very easily to make sure it's melted, as well as sanitary. I am just not that on it to do that. My partner, Kira, is. And so she's the one who does our hummingbird feeders. They can be great to have more hummingbirds and get them through the seasons where there's not as much flowers, even if we are trying to have as many flowers as possible, but make sure you clean them. Getting smaller and smaller. Bush tits are tiny, glean lots of insects and aphids, and have very funny, weird sock-shaped nests where they'll incorporate dryer lint and all sorts of other stuff. Oak titmouse is very, very charismatic. I really like them. We don't have enough oaks in our neighborhood. They need enough oaks to really be around, but we get them in our park sometimes at the Waterwise Community Center because we do have a lot of oaks. And then ravens and crows are also common. They will come and use our larger bird feeders. They'll also wash things off in them before they eat them. They are super intelligent. They can be a little bit aggressive with other birds. So during nesting season, sometimes if they seem like they are too interested in other trees where we know there's nests, I will kindly escort them off of the property. But really, really interesting, very intelligent. Ravens, if you're interested, are larger, often in pairs. And when they're flying, their tail feathers make it shield shaped, where crows are smaller, often in larger groups, and their tail feathers are fan shaped. Easiest way to tell them apart. And then the California or Western scrub jay is our medium-sized bluebird. Insects, acorns, seeds, and berries. Black phoebe, I already talked about. That's our aerial acrobat and insect eaters. And then house sparrows. House sparrows are not native, but are all over many of our neighborhoods. They're a very common European species that sound naturalized, eat seeds and sometimes insects, regular and bird bass. They can be a little bit aggressive sometimes, or can be aggressive sometimes with some of the other birds. And so again, if they seem like there's too many of them, maybe thinking about setting up residence where we have some of our native birds nesting. I'm not particularly mean to them, but sometimes I just make my presence known so they don't get too comfortable and try to edge out the other bird species, which sometimes get along more nicely with multiple species sharing the tree. You also might get acorn woodpeckers. Sometimes on telephone poles as well, especially if you have oak trees. Really fascinating to watch them make holes and individually fit their acorns. Their calls sound like deranged laughing. They're pretty cool. And then on the ground, you are likely to get mourning doves, which are very beautiful, very unintelligent, about the size of pigeons, and they love eating seeds. And then hawks. Hawks can be very hard to tell apart, but you might get red-shouldered hawk, red-tailed hawk, or Cooper's hawk. There's also smaller ones, kestrels, falcons, and things like that that you can look up. One really, really great resource, and I wanted to put some slides on it, but I forgot to put them up. I will type it into the chat. There is a free phone app that you can download called Merlin. Merlin, like the bird and the wizard. If you go to any place where you get the apps for your phone and you type in Merlin, you will find it. It's created by the Cornell Ornithology Lab, which is not local to us, but they do a lot of the great online bird resources for the whole country. And it's a bird identification app. So you can download the package for the Western US. And basically, it's a really intuitive thing where you can tell it where you are, or just have your phone sense where you are. The date, you can just say today, ask you some very easy questions about the size, the main color of the bird you're seeing, where you saw it, like if it was on the ground or in a shrub or at a water feature. And then it will come up with a list based on where you are, the date, and all the information of the birds that it's most likely to be, with incredible pictures, recordings of their calls, everything you need to do to identify it if you're interested. And then you can also have like a list. And so you can tell it that's your bird, and then you can kind of have a record of what you recorded when. Birdhouses. Should you use birdhouses? It's really up to you. Birdhouses are not necessary for some birds, but some birds prefer to nest in what in nature or in the wild would be kind of like the rotted cavity formed in an old dead branch of a tree. And we usually don't leave those in our backyards. And so to kind of mimic that, you can use a birdhouse, but it's not as simple as just like putting something with a hole up there. Bluebird houses are one of the most common things that people want to put up, to have bluebirds in their yard, which do like to nest in houses or cavities. So you need a properly sized hole, basically the smallest hole that'll work for your birds so that larger birds that might be predators can't get in. They need good ventilation. They need a roof overhang for when it rains, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can order, like if you go online and type in Bluebird House, you can see the different features. And so you can order, or you can also download plans if you want to make your own. Make sure that they're going to be properly sized. Do a little bit research about putting it in a safe location. You don't want to put it too close to branches where predators can get them. Certain ones for birds will want to be facing in a certain direction. So you can do your research. It's not rocket science, but you don't just want to do it kind of willy-nilly. And then you're going to want to be sure to take it out and clean and sanitize it every season as well to keep everything nice and sanitary. And so that's the basics for bees. And I will very quickly, for birds, I'll very quickly go through bees and butterflies and just kind of walk you through this. I'm not going to present you with as much information. Native pollinators and bees is a whole other thing that I'm not an expert on. I come from more of the plant side, and I like to create the whole system. But here's just some of the diversity you're likely to see. And if you don't know the name, doesn't matter. It doesn't prevent you from providing all of the habitat as well. So from bright iridescent green to leafcutter bees, which are super cool. And the leafcutter bees really like to use Western redbud, our native plant. You'll see these kind of crescent or half circle shapes cut out of the leaves. And I won't see the leafcutter bees on them, but you know that they've been there. And then they use that, they kind of chew it up and use it to create their nests. Digger bees are one of our ground dwelling species. They're adapted to those tiny manzanita flowers. Fuzzy California carpenter bees. These are often these are large bees. They're some of the first ones out in the season and go for a variety of flowers. Bumblebees are slightly smaller. They love sages as well as a lot of other things. Bee hotels. People are sometimes interested in making these bee hotels for the bees that would normally nest in cavities of wood. Here is an example of one that was done in, I think it was a piece of 4x4 lumber at the LA County Natural History Museum. You can see if you see them plugged, it's been used. Different bees will use different sizes. So you can kind of take a piece of wood and use between 1/8 and 1/2 inch diameter drill bits, about 5 inches deep. So you want a pretty deep drill bit. And then generally these will only be used once. And so if you're into it, you can do that, but I'm more lazy. And if you have something like this, it doesn't need to be that big, but just a pile of logs. As different areas open up, the bees will use that as well. So you don't necessarily need to make a whole project out of it. If you want to make a project out of it to kind of see the progress and monitor it, you can as well. And remember, a patch or two of bare soil is essential. Lizards. Most common backyard lizard in Southern California is going to be the Western fence lizard. This lizard looks like it could be about 5 or 6 different lizards. They're very variable. The males tend to have bright blue, not always this bright blue, but if you look at them closely, they'll be bright blue patches. And these are all around in my yard. I don't know, I probably have 100 of them at any time in my yard because they love all of the rocks and the broken concrete. And they're very territorial. So they do like these push-ups, both to cool themselves and to mark their territory. So it's really funny to see them looking at me and kind of doing their push-ups, letting me know that even though I come through, it's really the one who lives there. Occasionally we'll get an alligator lizard. These can get pretty big. We don't have nearly as many of them, but we do have them around. And I was looking at one the other day, and I was pretty sure later that afternoon, I saw a hawk swoop down. Definitely saw it swoop down. I think I saw it fly off with the alligator lizard I had been looking at. So that's part of the process as well. Hawks have to eat, but I hope that there's a few more. And so this is the other most common type, southern alligator lizard. The young ones are almost look like snakes sometimes because their limbs are so small still. And then you also might get the common side-blotched lizard. So here is, they always like to hang out around my bird bath. Usually have one doing push-ups defending this prime territory. Here one is on top of a log that we have in as a bird perch. And you can see this is the male, that blue spot for the Western fence lizard. Butterflies. Our most common backyard butterflies will be 10. There's many more. Monarch is the one that everyone wants to support with milkweed. And they need our help, so definitely plant some. I will say, if you plant our native narrowleaf milkweed, a couple of tips. They don't need much water, but they will thrive on more water. Where I've seen them growing mostly in the San Gabriel Mountains, when I've seen them on hikes, are actually not right down in the water, but kind of in like river or creekside areas in dappled partial shade. And so if you really want your milkweed to thrive, it would thrive in a place that gets a little bit more water than your normal native landscape, or that gets a little bit of extra water. So where I have mine in my yard is actually kind of around my fruit trees, where it gets the water from the irrigation system for our fruit trees, really thrives on that. And then just instead of having mulch, we have ground cover of all sorts of different native plants, and our milkweed loves it down there. Also, at the end of the season, milkweed looks like this. It's not the most beautiful thing, and then it gets cut back like we mentioned in the winter. So having it at the bottom of my yard near my fruit trees is much preferable. It can also spread aggressively if it's happy. And so it can do that down there. Doesn't need to look great year round. Looks beautiful when it's blooming in the spring. But I wouldn't necessarily want it in my front yard. Those aphids are great habitat and food for ladybugs as well. You'll also probably see a variety of swallowtail butterflies if you start doing all of this, which are very beautiful. They're larvae like California coffeeberry, ceanothus, our native cherries. There's a giant swallowtail that you might see, which is very beautiful. That's actually an Asian species, I believe, which its larval host plant is citrus, but we have a lot of citrus around. Their caterpillar are adapted to look like bird poop. So if you see something that looks like a huge bird poop that then starts moving on your citrus, that's actually a swallowtail caterpillar in disguise. Cabbage white is a common small butterfly and likes brassicas. There are native brassicas, but in our gardens, it also likes nasturtium, kale, all sorts of other things like that. California sister, super beautiful. Coast live oak. If you have room for an oak tree, plant one. Oak trees are our #1 habitat plants. Hundreds to thousands of different species interact with oak trees in a beneficial way. Morning cloak, common buckeye. Skippers are small, kind of thicker butterflies. They actually live on grasses, so our native bunch grasses are great habitat when they are caterpillars, and then they'll use nectar sources when they're older. They're also super territorial. So these tiny butterflies, but they will chase off either other butterflies, or also I'll see them chase off insects and occasionally even a bird from their little pack that they decide is their own. And our native buckwheats, which we have many beautiful ones, support the small different blue butterflies, as well as hair streaks. And so then to kind of wrap it up, let's talk plants. It's hard to choose favorites. Don't limit yourself to this list, but here is my general starting point. All these plants have profiles on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through these. We don't have time to go through one by one, plus I have everything written out, so I don't need to kind of read you the text on each of these. If you're interested, download the PDF. I want to make sure we have time for a few questions. Like I mentioned, I'll say it again, if you have room for an oak tree, plant a coast live oak. They get big over time, but yeah, if you have room, go for it. We had talked about milkweed. So here is, you can see on the left, this is my narrow leaf milkweed in the spring when things are looking great. And so you can see here, we have a combination of established and small fruit trees. And basically, we call this section of our yard our orchard meadow. So we have fruit trees. And then because it's a higher water use area, we have a living mulch of many, many great habitat native plants, also including yarrow and goldenrod, that don't demand a lot of water, but really thrive in that higher water situation. That's what the chrysalis looks like. But you can see this is an area where we planted it in our demonstration garden. It can really spread and take over if it's happy. We have some tips on annual wildflowers. Even more information about annual wildflowers on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Right now, we're setting up the area where you'll be able to really easily find that. But if you just go to the Inland Valley Garden Planner and type into the search wildflowers, you will find our kind of top tips on getting started with annual wildflowers. Wildflowers are also cool to work with on these small parkway areas where there's not a lot of shrubs you can fit. So a few smaller perennials, and then wildflowers are great. And then the rest of this walks you through kind of in different categories. So patio trees or small trees, favorite native plants for that, and why in terms of the habitat value of those plants. Some of them are large shrubs, and so you can go through all of that. See, we talk about large trees, shrubs and accents, all sorts of different options. So you can put together for Southern California, it's an awesome garden just from all of these different options. Because we're focused on the habitat here, I don't talk a lot about that right plant, right place or other cool features of the plants, but all of these plants, like I mentioned, have the Inland Valley Garden Planner entry, so you can learn about it. Also, there is an online workshop, as well as I'll be teaching it kind of live on Zoom like this a little bit later in the season. I think maybe next month. If not, it's the month after. You can check it out on our Eventbrite page called Favorite Plants for Inland Valley Gardens, where a lot of these plants are my favorite plants for other reasons in addition to the habitat. And so I'll talk about those other reasons on that workshop. So you can kind of combine all of that. So yeah, generally, you don't necessarily need to limit yourself to this by any means, but these are just all things that are easy to grow, do their job really well, and you're likely to be able to find them at nurseries that carry native plants. And so remember to research your plants online. Here's just a list of some additional sources of good information. Tree of Life Nursery, which is a cool nursery in San Juan Capistrano that has awesome demonstration plantings, has a lot of great information online. Also great information online about care. Mike Evans, who is one of the owners of the nursery, writes a monthly column about kind of care and interaction with your native garden. Definite great reading every month. Talks some about habitat, talks a lot about what you should be doing and thinking about in terms of plant care, and just really a very detailed lens to help you enjoy your native garden. I can't recommend that enough. Las Politas Nursery has great information online as well. And so here we're going to wrap it up. Here's the class in one slide, and then I'll ask you to do a very brief evaluation poll, and then I'll answer any questions that people have. Class in one slide. Plant a variety of native plants of different sizes that bloom throughout the year. Don't cut off your seed heads too soon, and when you do, if you can, leave them in the garden for the birds that will come back and eat the seeds, and for the little insects that will use the seed heads or the stems for habitat. Provide some source of clean water, but with your plants, don't be too clean. Leave some branches, sticks, and leaves if you are not in a wildfire danger area. And on the ground, a mix of wood chip mulch, some gravel, and some stone is great. And also remember to leave some bare soil. Those are the basics. Everything else on top of it is a bonus. And so with that, I will leave up. Here are many of the links that I mentioned throughout the workshop. And I am going to launch our closing poll. Just another quick 4 questions to let me know what you thought about the workshop. There's a lot of information to convey when we do these 3-hour workshops, and I really want to make sure that this content is working for people and you're getting what you are interested in learning out of it. So please let me honestly know what you thought about things. And then in addition to the polls, I really, really value any comments that you're willing to give me in the chat. It's always some tough choices in terms of what to include and what not to include in these workshops. And I'm always tweaking it and trying to make it better before every workshop. So if there's something that you learned that you know is going to be useful for you, I would love to know what that was in the chat. If there's something that didn't work for you, or for whatever reason you weren't thrilled with how it was presented, please let me know in the chat as well. I always read all of it and really consider all of it. So yeah, those specifics are really great in a way that the polls just don't let me know. And so with that, I will say thank you very much for spending a good chunk of your Saturday morning with me. And I will start answering any of the other questions that have come in. Let's see. So from Deborah, it just says where to grow native milkweed for future growth. So maybe I talked about that some. If you have, if I didn't answer that question already, please type it into the chat and let me know exactly what you are hoping to learn. Okay, not a whole lot of questions. Let's see. Check for some of the earlier questions I had to skip at the beginning. I will check and make sure people are still here. Okay, Margarita, you had a question earlier. I want to plant trees, but I want a kind that won't interfere with a brick wall and a driveway. I have about 12 feet wide by 40 foot long. And a foot by 4 long in between my patio and driveway. Okay, and a 12 foot wide by 40 foot long space, you have a lot of options. As long as you're watering appropriately, which is, like I mentioned, for most native plants, once a week at the beginning, and then tapering down to, in most cases, once every 3 to 4 weeks after that, you are going to be training the roots of your trees to grow deep. So a lot of times the problems with surface roots and breaking driveways and things like that are because trees are growing in lawns where we're watering 3 times, 4 times a week, and it's only 3 inches deep. So we're training all the roots to be right there at the surface. With native plants, we like to do the opposite right from the beginning. So a few choices to look into. And then also, in those smaller spaces, trees that aren't going to be super huge over time. So in those smaller spaces, look into some of the large shrubs that can kind of be pruned into small trees. So I would look at Toyon, can be kept to 12 feet wide, or at least, then maybe get a little bit wider up above. Catalina Island cherry, as well as hollyleaf cherry. One's taller than the other one, depending on what size you want, but both of those are great choices as well. Those would be kind of my go-tos. You can also look at things like desert willow. You're not going to quite want to get up into oak trees, but any of those trees kind of in the patio tree or large shrub in that list, if you download this list, should work pretty well for that situation. 1 foot wide by 4 feet long is not big enough to plant a tree in, though, for your smaller space. But plenty of other of the smaller perennial plants can work if they could spill over. Okay, question from Angie. When do crepe myrtle trees come back? So around here, they'll be coming back a little bit later in the spring. If like ours in our demonstration garden still don't have leaves on them yet, so don't be nervous if yours doesn't either. Okay, let's see. Elizabeth, I'm excited to start a more natural habitat in my front yard. My backyard is already habitat natural. Okay, that was a comment. Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay. I have a huge hummingbird bush from Everbright, like 10 feet high. It should be pruned, but I am afraid of damaging it. Some branches are 2.5 to 3 inches diameter. Can you give me a tip? So I am not sure what you're referring to by hummingbird bush. There is not, that's the tricky thing with common names. People like me who think a lot about plants like to use the scientific names because then we know we're talking about the exact plant. So with the what are called common names of plants, there's so many different ones that can have the same name or different names that I am not sure what you mean by hummingbird bush. So unfortunately, I can't really help you. Oh, butterfly bush. Okay, if it's butterfly bush, yeah, that's Buddleia. Those, when they are dormant, you can just cut away at them usually. And normally to keep them looking good, every couple of years, they get a pretty hard cutback because they put off just so much of that stemmy growth. And so if you want some more specifics, you can look up online how to how to prune butterfly bush, but what I can say is in most cases, you're going to be fine with being pretty aggressive with butterfly bush. Yeah, I would say whenever something's really overgrown and I say just go for it, I always say I can't guarantee what will happen, but it is common to prune that plant aggressively is what I can say. And before it leaves out again is when to do it. Okay, let's see. From Mark, I have a 4-foot wide bed that is along a 10-foot high wall, is about 50 feet long and has 8 feet to grow out away from the bed. Okay. Half the length is full sun and the other half is part shade from a tall shed. What would be good screen shrubs that would work good with this? So we have very long and 4 feet wide, but it can grow out more. So I would look into that. I would say I would look towards some of those habitat hedge plants. I would look at a combination of California coffeeberry, holly leaf cherry, coyote brush. Those would be like my big ones. In the part shade area, you might look at some of the easier to grow ceanothus. So maybe either Concha ceanothus or Ray Hartman ceanothus. You can also consider some of the easier to grow manzanitas, though they'll grow quite slowly. So you can consider, if you have many years for them to grow in, like Sunset or Ray Hartman manzanita, but again, those will grow slower. And then also you can consider they'll want to get bigger, but they take pruning really well, are native roost species. So I don't talk about them, but they're great. I don't talk about them as much because there's so many great plants, but I like growing them at home in habitat hedge and they take pruning well. But that would be sugar bush and lemonade berry would be some of the things that can all be good. A mix of all of those would be super great for habitat. Okay. And let's see, I see a couple of questions that came in the chat. So if I see them, I will answer those. If there's any other questions, feel free to type them in. From Anne, is there anything natural to put on milkweed instead of cutting it down since it's already getting warm, or is cutting them back the best option? I saw a 10% bleach solution could get rid of the OE parasites. So honestly, I will say at least in my gardens right now, okay, it's getting warm, but our milkweed that we cut back isn't putting on a lot of growth yet, and the monarchs aren't really showing up much yet for the season where I am. So I would say still cut it back if that is the case for you. When they grow, milkweeds, if they're happy, they're going to grow a lot. So it's not like you're going to cut it back and then kind of miss your growth for the season if you do it now. 10% bleach solution might work. 10% bleach solution works for a lot of stuff. But the question is, can you really get into all of those little cracks and crevices with your spray bottle up and down your whole plant? And my thought is that would be just about impossible to do. So I would personally go with still kind of cutting it back would be probably the best practice. Okay. So I think that gets us through all the questions. If there's anything else, I'll hang out for just another moment while people exit the workshop to make sure I can answer it. But if that's it, thank you again, everybody. Have a good rest of your weekend and happy gardening. Oh, from Everbright. Yeah, I am not familiar with that plant. It's not one that we commonly grow out here. So I would say a couple of options is look it up online with, the like search engine with pruning or maintenance, or also I'm not sure about Florida, but a lot of states have local master gardener programs where you can reach out for questions at an email or a phone. So you might look up and see if there's a master gardener program that serves your area of Florida and ask there. And that might be another way to get some great knowledge.